about? Because what's been going through your mind these days, my friend?
Well, I just finished watching your video with Theory Underground. You absolutely killed it. Like, what have I been thinking about? Well, that definitely influenced a lot of my thinking. I guess what I've been thinking about is after you realize the necessity for structures for interaction and the need for the absolute choice. So after you have that realization, and then after you make the choice, then what? I guess is the next. I mean, I feel like that's just like the reasonable next step. Um, but then part of me is like, when you ask, then what? Is that where the structure of interaction and like abiding by that goes a bit too far, or it becomes a bit too much of like a dictatorship of you having to, okay, you made this choice and now you must follow this like this, and like almost like a recipe where you have to just bake things, like you have to do this and this and this all according to the absolute choice you made based off of this way of realizing the structure of interaction. So I guess I've been thinking about that because I feel like that's, I guess, where storytelling comes in, but I feel like that's like different than storytelling in a certain sense. And also I've been feeling this distinction between I guess storytelling and sociology. Uh, I guess like clearly there's overlaps in my mind, like based off of just listening to your video at Theory Underground. But I guess storytelling really has to do with just like the individual, and I guess sociology is more than just the individual. I don't know, but those are some things I've been thinking about lately.
Well, that is delightful, and it's good to see Chetan, Tyler, and Steve, and Mr. Wynn, and Michelle, and Dimitri, all you wonderful people. Well, it actually is a tremendous question. I'm glad Steve's here because he does so much with training. Like, what are the limits of commitment? Is there a point when, like, committing to something and enduring it, there's actually a wisdom in knowing when to stop? Like, if you say, okay, I'm going to go all in on this one thing, is there a certain point where it's actually good to go, nah, I'm going too much into it. I need to back out because there could be a certain obsessiveness where you're destroying your family and your relationships and everything. But then on the flip side, there's always the danger of just saying, oh, well, the reason I don't commit to something is because I don't want to risk my family and friends, but you're actually just saying that to avoid commitment. And to really pour yourself into something. That's always quite an interesting question on when and Win was mentioning this in the chat, like it's almost like you make a choice and you work it to a point where it reaches a certain saturation and then you realize you need to move to something else or kind of move to the next thing. I think it's very interesting. Like if I think of myself, like I did a photography business for 10 years. And what was the point where I realized that I wasn't supposed to go further on it? Because, I set up deals with Michael's to get photography, to get photo frames. I did like lots of weddings, bought cameras, did all these things. But then there was a certain point where you kind of recognize that this phase of life is over, or that you need to sublate it into something else or move into something else. And it's very interesting, like what is that sense and where does that sense come from? And when I think also there were parts of it where you're kind of like, in order to go to the next level of photography, I have to buy a way more expensive camera, get really good at these kind of weird wedding portraits that I don't even like taking it, where it's kind of really fake. And it feels like the photographer also was increasingly, and I'll give it to Chetan here, in the business of a certain, not only was I supposed to take pictures, I was expected to write blogs about how it was the most beautiful day ever. And it all felt like the industry was being captured by Instagram and social media. And I grew up like working and like setting up deals with art galleries and consignment deals. And it felt so clickbaity that was also a feeling of a need to shift. And thank you, Michelle. That's like a need to kind of shift in different things. And that actually might speak, and then I'll pass it to Chetan and Steve here, on a bit on, because there is a difference between sociology and philosophy and the absolute choice, but there's something about the sociological condition that is almost a check on the philosophical decision that you make, and where does it fit in, and how do you fit it in? Are you making a choice that works against social intelligibility? That has to be expanded a lot more, but let me give it to Chetan and then Steve. Chetan, please, it's good to see you, sir. I hope you are doing well.
Yes, I'm good. Lovely to see you all also. Uh, it's a great and really interesting question to think about, what you just asked, and sort of triggered me in on a certain tangent. I remember this debate between Gandhi and Tagore. If you would know any of these figures, the famous figures in from the Indian context, where Gandhi's sort of point was that if you promise something and if you say commit to something, you should sort of stand by it no matter what happens. His emphasis upon truth. And Tagore was sort of critiquing Gandhi, and he was taking this sarcastic stand upon Gandhi that you can always change your mind. You get, and Tagore is a more mystical one, more, and he's always sort of is putting the point across that whatever you said yesterday might not hold today. And in that context, you should be able to completely be able to, as freely say that I don't think that, what I said yesterday holds today, and this is the reason, and which is why I'm able to. And it's a very interesting question that emerges on the question of promise over here. That is what we're trying to think. And Nietzsche has very beautiful lines upon this question of promise. That this ability to make promises, if you remember, and this question of pain, this second essay of Genealogy of Morals. If you think about it, that how does human being become an animal that can make promises? And it's not an easy question to I think both sides have very interesting arguments to make in this regard, because if we completely disregard our ability to make a promise itself, stand by our word at a future date, we completely lose the capacity to have a will. Because will is this capacity to create this consistency in ourselves. Without that, you cannot will something as human beings. Without that, you cannot, in some senses, enter into what you call the symbolic chains of your times. Yet, what is this problem in this process, such that at any point of time we can what is the other side of it, where we can actually find a certain anti-foundationalist stance to it, that no matter what we've committed to, and it's not like we will not commit, but what is the space for changing our minds within this structure? And it's not an easy, as I said, it's easy to sort of go back to the point and say there is no promise, there is none of that has any value. It's difficult to have that value in yourself, have extreme esteem value for promises, for commitments, and yet be able to change your mind when the moment arises. What is that and how do we think through it, and just sort of raising it and
I think that's a tremendous framing, and then I'll give it to Steve and Mr. Wynn here. I think that notion of the promise, what is the space of changing your mind? Because there's one way you can argue where it would be easy if you say, well, I chose it and I'll see it through, when maybe it actually can take some courage to change your mind, because then everyone can see you as wishy-washy and there's a certain fear you have to face to do it. But then there's also something very problematic of the notion of not keeping your promises or not keeping your commitments. And so there's a certain encounterology, just to use that phrase, because I love using, there's a certain, it when it arises in the kitchen, when you're cooking the ingredients, right? It makes me also think of the weird thing where choice and freedom are actually kind of opposites. Like once I make a choice, I lose possibility because I've chosen X instead of the other things, right? And yet we tend to associate freedom with choice, but really, in a way, you have more freedom before choice because then there's more possibility. But then if it's pure possibility, it's nothingness, right? There is no freedom because there's nothing there. But the moment you make a choice, then it's as if your freedom is limited, but then it also opens up new horizons. So there's something also about the inability to change your mind, that is the inability to move between choice and freedom in a way. You can't keep them in a certain flux, but then there's something problematic about not having that ability to move, but then also treating it very too emptily, not taking it seriously enough, right? Where you can just flow between things. It's very interesting, but let me give it to Steve and then Mr. Wynn. Steve, it is good to see you, sir. I hope you are doing well.
I am doing well. Thank you for hosting this. I haven't been able to be here a few times. My life is, this time is challenging sometimes. So I wanted to pick the ball up around this idea of, well, first, with the idea of freedom requires constraints, absolutely, in order to be truly functional. Otherwise, as you said, Daniel, you'll just go, right? But I do think it's instructive to kind of think about, when I think about, I'm a running coach, so I spend a good bit of time thinking about some of these issues about how far you can go and how much work you can do and when is too much. And I do find the middle way very constructive here. I do think, not necessarily from just the Buddhist perspective, but just even as a Westerner, thinking through the middle way as antithetical to the appetite / get shit done, cut people's heads off and shit down their throats kind of attitude that is this world that we live, modern world that we live in, especially in America, it seems to me. So I do think I have found that when I work with people who are on the cusp of something amazing or they're falling apart, we're operating in some sort of middle way capacity, some sort of threading this needle between too much work and not enough work. But you never really ever know if it's in the sweet spot. So you have to keep calibrating and recalibrating and recalibrating. And maybe this relates to the kind of space that Chetan was talking about with, promise and ambition, or where are we holding our promise? If we're sitting in a middle way, we're not off the edge, we're not pressing out to the furthest extent. My perspective around this is usually you have to trust, at some point in time, we have to trust ourselves. And when you're in a middle way position, you always have a place to come back to kind of sort of work from, maybe a home base or a space in which to operate. I do think it's useful. And whether you're talking about it philosophically or you're talking about it in a sports-related environment, or even if you're just losing your shit, finding a place to sit in between, in the middle. It's not cool. It's not the thing to do. It's not necessarily what you tell everybody you're doing, but it is highly useful. So for what that's worth.
No, I like that very much. And Steve's also a tremendous writer. I like his work, and it's good to have you here, sir. And what you were saying, it makes me think, and then I'll give it to Wynn and Dimitri here. One of the things that's interesting, because you were just saying, like, tell people about, I wonder if part of it is being wise about speaking, because if you're in a middle position and you're experimenting and trying to figure out you're going to be a photography business, just so much as you never verbally told everyone, oh yeah, I'm going to spend my life being a photographer, it seems easier to be in that experimental place. But once you put it on Instagram or talk about it or put it on your resume, then it feels like a promise. And so maybe there's something here also about a certain wisdom of knowing when to speak. But, because it's almost like that sweet spot or figuring out between promise and ambition, a lot of that has to do with the speaking or the social engagement that you had. And so if you're wise and can kind of withdraw and not speak carelessly, then that might help you with this tension. And Mr. Rivera, good to see you there. But it becomes difficult if you're in a society where everyone's asking you, what are you going to do for your life? What are you planning to do? What's your 5 years plan? You got this kind of social pressure that might be making it more difficult to exist in that space to figure out the sweet spot of those things. But let me give it to Mr. Wynn and then Dimitri. Mr. Wynn, it is good to see you, sir. I hope you're doing well.
Good evening, everybody. It's good to be here. I missed last week's session, and I felt this lack. And I was questioning myself, and then I remembered I missed the Thursday session, so it's becoming an addiction. Basically, I think this is a nice way to frame some of the ideas I've been thinking through myself about, like, basically just trying to thread what's being said. Like, the fact is, for me, that you can never find kind of an absolute truth, and so an absolute choice in a particular historical moment, like in the sense that when I look around me at the particular things in my life, I have to make decisions, I have to make choices. But based upon those instances, I can never find, like, I can never promise anything. Like, things are constantly changing, things are constantly becoming. And then in that sense, you can, if you're kind of seeing this through kind of the nihilistic lens, you could say, which again, I'm not a nihilist, but you could say like things are decaying, things are changing, things are moving. So there's no way for me to promise anything in that space. But I think this is where philosophy for me is really finding its home, is to say that truth and choice and decision can lie in our relation to change in that sense. And I think in that sense, we can be skeptical and free to be against Gandhi in that sense of saying, no, we can rethink our decisions. We can rethink our political programs. We can think our own self-relation. I can reuse the mask of my own self-identification in that sense. I can constantly re-envision myself. I can constantly recreate myself because I'm not trying to find truth in the self that I've created. I'm finding truth in my relation to myself, which is freed or opened or released, or, you know, these words that I like to use following Heidegger's thinking. And I think this goes back to what we said 2 weeks ago with Alex Ebert, like this phenomenology versus ontology in a way. Like, do we find truth in our ontological idea of what something is in itself, in its being? Like, can I tell you what being or life is in itself and make an absolute choice for this? Because I think modern and postmodern philosophy would creep in to say, look, like your idea of what life is or your idea of what being is kind of falls apart or should be subject to criticism. It should be subject to change in some sense. But I think this is where Heidegger says, wait a minute, like being is that which lets you experience the freedom of change and difference. Being is that which gives you like the ability to not have to make an absolute choice for the historical moment, but in experiencing that freedom, you can make the absolute choice for freedom itself, maybe. And I think this is my way of experiencing freedom, change, historicity, contingencies. Because otherwise, like if you have a negative experience in life and you say that that is life in itself, you're making a choice for life. But I think life is that which is always surprising. And I think you can never find an absolute truth if you try to find or determine what life is in itself. But when you let that choice be and say, okay, I don't need to do this anymore, maybe you can then experience a true decision for life, which is to let things be. And I think maybe there's truth on that side of things in a way. And that kind of goes to the middle position of what Steve would say, is maybe it's not in the middle, maybe it's looking to the kind of quality of the experience in its entirety, rather than the specific content of, for example, like running. If you're a running coach, I'm sure you can know the technical knowledge of what's good for one specific person in their particular instance of their running journey. But you can't make an absolute choice because that person is particular in their experience of running. But again, you can know how technique would help that person in that instance. But maybe what you can teach them is absolute true, is to have like a certain relationship to running, you know, to be patient, to let that instant be. And maybe that's the universal wisdom in some sense, rather than the specific content, you know. Yeah, anyway, that's just my, again, it's like framing how in a way, like, how do we do philosophy in that space of, yeah, how are we approaching philosophy itself, or knowledge, or technical knowledge, or speculative knowledge, you know. To go back to what Buber said, like, how is it that, oh, Luber, sorry, Buber, it's because I was thinking of Javier, the philosopher that he studies. Sorry, that's a Freudian slip. I see you as this great thinker. Like, at what point do we thematize things again? Well, maybe we can find truth in a theme which lets things be. And then you have the specific moment by moment themes that continue to, oh, Andrew's comment. It's true. But like that let you enjoy the freedom of each theme or each horizon or each region of experience, you know. And I think again that goes back to then the freedom thing as well.
Delightful. And I saw Javier instantly put up his hand when he heard Luber. So that was delightful. Give it to Dimitri, Mr. Luber, and Rivera. I like what you said a lot. It makes me, so there's a few things. I remember where once in wrestling, one of the coaches said, we were working with some of the younger athletes, he said something like, don't make a lot of rules, because whatever rules, you have to enforce them. So be really careful. Like, don't make a lot of rules, because whatever rules you make, you really need to stick to. So likewise, be really aware of what choices you make or commitments you make, because if you make one, you really have to see it through. And maybe, and then also, I really like Chetan's comment on this idea of, is there a point where maybe there are like cases where to keep a promise, you have to break it? Like there are things like if you say, I'll always love you to someone, there might be a point where you need to do something that they would think is an act of not loving them, which is precisely what they need to get them through to a deeper love, right? Like these are the weird kind of movements. So then the question is, when we ask like the absolute choice, what is that toward? Because there's another way in which if we treat reality, like you're talking about ontology, like if you absolutely treat things as stagnant, as things, you cut yourself off from the opening of the process of how things unfold, right? So you would want to make an absolute choice, not so much to the stagnant moment, but to the process of surprise. And your commitment is to the ability to be able to handle what comes up, or the kind of encounter with things, or being when you say, I love you to someone, or you marry someone, you're not committed to the frame of that moment and making that everything, but you're committed to actually working through. It's more like you're committed to working through them in this motion of the unfolding of what that love actually means that you can't know ahead of time. And then I think that actually just from a practical standpoint is really important, because if you're more so committed to the unfolding of what love is, that you only think you know what love is, then when it unfolds, you won't feel like you're betraying an initial vow. Because I think that happens to people. Like if you feel like you made a certain, like you can't move with it because you have an idea that you committed to something that you would be betraying, therefore you can't, you set yourself up to be incapable of breaking the promise to keep the promise. As kind of like, as Chetan was saying. And there's something about life like that. But let me give it to Dimitri, Mr. Luber, and then Mr. Rivera. Dimitri, I like your aesthetic there. It's very epic with the background. That looks tremendous. It's good to see you, sir.
I will read a quote by my favorite playwright from the Renaissance, from the Netherlands. It's translated to English, so it's already... It's not so good as it is in Dutch, but it gets the point across. Is it that the eternal shining light conceals itself in the night of the world? Is it like this, guys? Is it like this? Because if it is like this, then that means that that night of the world isn't the final say in things. And I've been reading some novels which were all written around the year 1900, and I've learned a lot from it. For example, that people just met each other for a few times and they would already choose to marry each other. And from all the novels I've read by different authors, it would be all super romantic. They would say things that would seem ridiculous to us today, like they would say, I love you for eternity, and things like this. People today would scoff at it and be like, what the fuck? Of course not. The eternity is not even a thing. What are you talking about? This is kind of the world we're living in, right? The very notion of eternity is ridiculous to people. And if you look at the statistics of when are people marrying today in Europe and the United States, it's like way older than it used to be. People used to marry at age like 20, 22 maybe. 25, you're already old. You're already old when you're 25 to marry. But nowadays, people are in Europe, the median age, it doesn't matter what country you go to. Okay, maybe in the East it's a bit younger, but not as young as you would expect. It's all around their 30s, like 32, 35, these types of ages. And then, of course, if you listen to the way people talk about they talk about the people that they marry or are in a relationship in, you can still see it a little bit with older people in my country, they would call their loved one like a loved one, you know, my love, this and that, when they refer to their partner. But young people, they say girlfriend or boyfriend, you know, and stuff like this, or like friend even. And I think this is so interesting that there is this, people are really uncomfortable with the closeness of eternity, so they would rather not speak it. But this illusion is still very much present. The illusion that whatever love you meet, whenever you're falling in love, there is the illusion of eternity. Otherwise, there's no love. If you have an inhibition, if you have a distance, then I don't want to give advice, but she's probably not the one, or he's probably not the one. If you have this initial inhibition, you have to fall into the illusion that they are the one. And even if you start doubting it after that, okay, that's always, you know, you have to contextualize things and, you know, not be stupid with it. But this illusion, or I don't even want to call it an illusion, because I think that's too ideological, and I think that's too much falling into this contemporary ideology. I think you can also see this with the way that we think about religion today, you know, through the death of God and new atheism, that people like Richard Dawkins or Jordan Peterson always call themselves something like, I'm not a Christian, I'm a cultural Christian, or I'm a moral Christian, or like a political Christian. Like, they always have to add another word. And then they also say, well, I don't really believe in God, but I think Christianity has done things that are okay for the world. And then they say, you know, someone like Peterson actually would then say, well, we should act as if God exists. And to me, this is utterly cynical. It's like saying, you know, I'm going to act as if, in my case, you know, because I'm heterosexual, I love her for eternity, as if I am going to be together with her for eternity. And it's not like this. There is no as if. There is no as if. I would really like say there is this kind of inhibition to really speak the naivete of eternity in a hopeful way is a problem for us today. And we can see this with the age that people are marrying at, and the way that people are talking about the loved ones, and also in family, you know, like even just saying the word father or mother, or like accepting that this person in your family is in that role and they're never going to get out of that role. And you can actually, you know, bring this out, because, you know, sometimes people like to talk about all the rituals that we have, that it's just commercial rituals, you know, Christmas or Father's Day or Mother's Day. They would say it's just for the market. But I think actually all these people who say this have a deep discomfort with the fact that your father is just your father, dude, and he is an imperfect human being, and it's super awkward sometimes, and it's very intense sometimes, but it's always going to be like that. And speaking that and having a ritual for that, I think is valuable. And I think this speaks a lot to how we relate to religion today, and also especially like Christianity as the religion of love. So one more thing I want to say is that, you know, we have a mind, and then we have two hands, but we only have like one way to handle things. We're kind of cursed to this. So yeah, the middle is nice in my mind, but the moment I act something out, even if I have two hands, I have to act out in this or that way. I have to say, I adhere to this eternity, and this is my passion, or I am going to prioritize this over this, you know, and leave something behind. And this is this kind of eternal paradox or eternal dilemma that we're always in, that in our mind we can reconcile it, especially, you know. And I think, Daniel, what you said, it's so important to be able to cultivate the ability to not immediately react, but retract, think it through, and then handle things. The power of this is, it shouldn't be underestimated. But it's also difficult for ourselves. You know, the other day, some guy was being a bit mean to me, and I could be mean to him, but then I chose not to respond. And it was annoying because I had to overthink it. I was like, this guy's like nagging in my mind, you know. But then he kind of continued, and I just kind of calmly told him what I thought of it, not to react, in his kind of childish game back to him. But anyway, Fichte had this amazing idea. It's about the I. And for Fichte, there's basically three I's to simplify it. There's the absolute I, which is the I which you can like self-comprehend in retraction. If you're like thinking the I, it's kind of abstract. Then this I, which is an absolute I and like infinite and eternal, in a way has to finitize itself, which is the infinite I. And then it's infinite I because it comes against the non-I. But this non-I for Fichte is not just objective reality as it is out there, but this non-I is actually created by the absolute I. Now, the way I view this, I've talked about this before, is that this is what the word actuality means to me, because in German actuality is Wirklichkeit and Wirken is working. So the absolute I chooses what to work on, but has to not only have a vision of like, okay, I'm going to make a song and this is the title, it actually has to go through the process of finitizing itself and being frustrated because nothing fucking works in my project. But it's like that very obstacle is your absolute I choosing what obstacle you're overcoming. And here I think something like the ability to have the simplicity of virtue is so important, to be able to stay with your decision. And I mean, there's like, people like to say it's important to have good boundaries, I always think it's the opposite. No, it's like important to go beyond your boundaries so that you can retroactively look on how you have fucked it up. And again, this is not an advice. Don't come to me saying that, you've made big mistakes on this, because I do all the time, but that's how I try to learn. And I think that these are things I wrestle with when we talk about the conversation of choice and freedom, because there is a way that we are in this predicament that we cannot get out of it. But immediately the problem here is that shouldn't mean that we get cynical and start becoming inactive and start becoming and stop moving, because the moment we do that, we are stagnating, and there's lots of destruction to that. So that's it for me.
Excellent. And so first off, I don't think the Valentine's card that says I'll love you for 15 years, 2 months, and 3 weeks is going to do too well. You need that eternity. But that's so interesting how there's this kind of, if you don't say eternity, there's no authority to it. And there's a kind of holding back. And yet there's also a certain, well, let me not be hyperbole. It's like, if you're like, it's interesting because as you were talking, and also Michelle, we got married as babies. We were like babies. Man, these people 32 or whatever, we're like little babies getting married or different things in our, But it was also interesting as you were talking there, and like the two hands, I really like that. We have two hands, but only one way to handle things. That's really interesting. It was almost like when you were speaking, and then I'll give it to Luber and Mr. Rivera. Obviously everyone knows in Hegel that the fear of error is the fear of truth. It's almost like the fear of choice is the fear of freedom. The fear of like lying is the fear of the possibility of actually doing something. Like this dilemma that you're describing, maybe it's the difference between, because it seems like you need a certain flexibility space, like, this kind of like something where you're trying to figure out how to do bothness, but you're set up to kind of fail because you can only, like you say, handle things one way. But then the answer is not to say, well, then I'm not going to go into that space. Well, that's the fear of that space is the fear of living in a way, right? So the fear of error is the fear of life. The fear of saying, well, I don't want to say I love you for eternity because that's a hyperbole. Well, the fear of hyperbole is the fear of saying any commitment, is the fear of love. There's some interesting willingness to enter into a space of getting it wrong, like almost necessarily because of this flexibility, that if you don't do, and then it's like, well, that's actually, prudent or rational to not go into that. Well, then you're not human. Then there's something that's deeply missing out if you don't do that. And also, like you were saying about that moment of being able to withdraw, I definitely think so much of philosophy, if all philosophy is the training of the capacity to create 1 second of hesitancy, 1 second of pause, that can radically change your life for the better. And yet that very pause, funny enough, creates a split between you and the world that could be the source of anxiety, right? But if you don't create that pause, then you're just at the mercy of whatever that occurs, and all sorts of bad stuff can occur, right? So it's a good, so the fear, the fear of the split is the fear of, not ending up in situations that suck, right? So you have to create that pause. It's almost like the fear of the split. I'm just keep using this phrase because it's interesting. It seems to be framing some of what we're describing. The fear of the split is then the fear of the pause that you need to have freedom. Like the fear of the split between you and the world that then opens a kind of gap that can be a source of anxiety because there's a distinction there. That actually is then the fear of the very split that you need to have a certain agency, to have a certain control over your situation so you don't own them. Well, then freedom and anxiety go together in that sense. But it's interesting here because this idea of not wanting to make a commitment or holding back a little bit, like it's like the fear of error is the inability to fully give in, like the fear of not being willing to actually have to figure things out as they unfold differently is then the very fear of having anything unfold at all. It's very interesting there in this human situation. But let me give it to Mr. Luber and Mr. Rivera. Mr. Luber, I saw your puppy. I saw Heidi. I saw the puppy. It was so cute.
He's so precious. I do want a couple things to say. I find it funny that Michelle says in the chat that, what did she say? Something about uncertainty, when maybe meeting you guys in terms of like finding a relationship was the worst thing that ever happened to me, because I'm like thinking to myself, oh my God, this is like very ideal here. Am I ever going to find something like this where it seems like they're able to both juggle all these hats together? And it's like that the juggling of those hats seems pretty certain from my perspective. So it's pretty funny from, it appears a very certain situation for that situation to say, well, it's actually pretty uncertain. I find that very funny. And I wonder, I definitely want a response to this, not to put either of you on the spot with like your relationship, but it's like, do you guys feel every day that it's uncertainty? Because to me, it's like when I met you guys, it's like certainty to the max in like a beautiful way, where it's like I don't know, just that there didn't seem to be anything in doubt or in question, and everyone, like you were doing your thing with your business, and like Michelle's like juggling with the kids and like with cooking, and then you come home and you help juggle with the kids, and it's like all this juggling. It just seems like a very certain situation. So I'm curious with that. And then with what you guys are saying in terms of like a loving relationship, do both parties need to have the same idea as what the one is? Like if there is a relation and both entities in the relationship have a different conception of what the one is that relation even possible? Are they able to even interact with different ideas of how the one is structured, essentially? And then another thing is, when, not so much a question, but more of a claim, I think when you approach a relation and you're approaching the relation in terms of the ground, and like the ground is used a lot and very used like loosely, but what I mean by ground is essentially realizing the non-rationality that goes into the relationship. Not that there's this rational ground or this irrational ground per se, but almost a bothness that's entailed in the ground, which I think is a concept that everyone here is pretty familiar with. But I do think that a relation requires both or all entities to have a sense of the ground in this particular way, that good and evil and all these different dichotomies can come forth within a proposition, you know, like a proposition when someone says, oh, the good is the bad. Well, if you were to break that down and you were to approach it not just simply like the subject predicate, but you look at in terms of like the copula of the is, and you look at, okay, what are the presuppositions in a certain sense that give rise to the possibility of the subject predicating such, you know, whatever it's predicating. And then kind of just to like piggyback off that a little bit, I think when you're approaching a proposition or a relation from this ground, this non-rational ground, or the focus of the presuppositions that give rise to the is of the proposition in question, if the predicate can't in turn be turned into a subject in itself that predicates its own unfolding, then it seems that freedom isn't there. It seems that there's this static relationship between how you are coming into the proposition, where you see the subject almost strangling the predicate, where in like a loving relationship, you come into the proposition, so to speak, where the subject gives rise to the predicate in such a way that the predicate isn't necessarily solely entangled by the subject, but gives possible new predications to like to be, how do I say this? To basically, when you say the good is the bad can then be turned into its own sentence, if you will, that kind of sheds light on what the good is the bad mean. Exactly. Like the meaning can be expanded upon through not just the subject, but through the predicate itself. And that the predicate itself can then in turn be a subject in its own right. So, I mean, to me, and then I'm trying to, my dog's banging on the door. Basically, sorry, does this have anything to do, basically, when you see the subject strangholding the predicate, when you react to a loved one and you're not able to internalize it and like think through it first? Like, is there a certain sense of, oh, like there's like these determinations that are quickly made because you know them in a certain sense so well that you're able to snap because you don't need to think through it so much. So in that sense, you're not really coming at it from like a ground perspective, so to speak, but you're coming at it, I guess, in a different way. I'm not sure, but I'll just leave it off with just saying that having a, how you approach a relationship or any type of relation seems to be impossible if you're not coming from this like dynamic ground perspective. And then the question becomes, how do you get other people to realize this ground perspective? And then do they need to realize it in the same way in which you realize it? To me, it's almost like, yes, they do need to realize it in the same way you realize it, which is this like dynamic, non-rational way of looking at it. Otherwise, it becomes like, it self-cannibalizes the whole situation. But then it's like, it becomes like a tyranny where it's like a one way of looking at the one, even though that one way is dynamic. I don't know. I'm just, there seems to be some contradiction that I'm trying to work through in my head. So thank you for bearing with me.
No, I think, and I'll give it to Javier and then Michelle here, and then kind of to, you know, I think when Michelle says committed to the uncertainty, and I'm glad you like our juggling skills. You know, it's really weird to have 3 children that you're throwing in the air. They don't tend to like it, but over time they get used to it and it doesn't bother them so much. I think the commitment to, there's something about where the uncertainty is the unfolding of a thing that you committed to that you didn't know how it would unfold until it unfolded, but whatever it is, you're ready for it. And to me, the absolute choice in being a choice that is of the absolute in the Hegelian sense versus where it's everything that is the case plus you existing in a feedback loop with it versus the Wittgensteinian truth, which is everything that is the case in a stagnant sense. An absolute choice is a commitment to this unfolding of this thing that changes as you're involved in it. And whatever it is, you have a certain confidence in your capacity to meet it. And I think there is something to be said where both parties have to see the ground in that way, in that sort of flexibility. Like, because the question you could also ask is when you commit to something, what are you committing to? Like, what do you commit to if you commit to a relationship? Or you commit, let's even say like a job or writing. What do you commit to if you commit to philosophy? Well, I mean, I doubt you're like 100% aware of what books you'll read or what all ideas will happen. The same with a relationship. It's almost like what you're doing in a commitment is you're committing to, well, encountering the surprise, being prepared for the surprise, or you're committing to wherever this might take me. Almost maybe, I wanted to say Ulysses stuffing wax in his ears and then seeing what goes. But it's like you're committing to an unfolding of a thing that you can't really plan for, you have to prepare for, to use that distinction. I think one of the issues is that we commit to plans, not commit to preparation and processes of working to be prepared for the unfolding so that we can meet it. I definitely think that gets people in trouble. I mean, honestly, because we've also culturally, to point at the sociology question, then I'll give it to Rivera, is since we exist in a culture that thinks a rational, responsible, good person plans everything out, you have a 5-year plan, you plan what you're going to do career, you have a model of what you're to do, then that results in the on average people not having this more flexible basis for their interactions, because flexibility is uncertainty, you're not prepared, you don't know what you're doing with your life, and you don't understand things, right? Because if you really were knowledgeable and understood what you were getting for, you would know the billiard ball would hit another ball or ball, the relationship would do X, Y, and Z. If you had this many things would unfold, right? So that then creates a subconscious association where having this more dynamic interaction, like you're pointing to there, Mr. Luber, then becomes subconsciously associated with what you're not supposed to do, which of course then is setting people up for failure because it's setting them up to have expectations aligned with a predictive model in their relationships or their careers and things like that. And then, of course, when that breaks, people then look to blame someone, and that's when the social contract breaks down, governments break down, people don't want to get married because I can't trust anything, they don't want to have kids, like that breaks things down. But if we socially actually incubated people to associate a commitment with throwing yourself into a dynamic process of preparing for it, then that would change things. And I guess I would also say with that, this kind of weird double move it seems to have is when you commit, like when you commit to something, an absolute choice, you're committing to experimentation, kind of. You're experimenting to a process of trial and error. Like you're experimenting to a working through things. Like we usually say, like if you commit to philosophy, it's almost like you're committing to experimentation, trial and error, figuring that like a groping around it's like groping around in a certain darkness is what you're committing to. Likewise, when you commit to a relationship, and by darkness, I mean this uncertainty. You're committed to groping around and feeling things out and then getting better. I mean, the other thing I guess I would say is in a relationship, you're also committing to, if when groping around in the dark, you feel something that suggests you were wrong about something or that your ideas of what was here in the dark or the uncertainty was wrong, you're willing to change, as opposed to fall back and say, well, that can't be what I think it is. You're willing to change with it. So it's almost like commitment in this sense that is finding this dynamic flexibility is more in the realm of words like preparing, experimentation, and your commitment to, and so you're not afraid of error, and you're also not afraid of being wrong. Because if and when you're groping, you find something that's wrong, you're able to admit it. So there are some quality characteristics here that I think that could be part of it. But let me give it to Mr. Rivera and then Michelle. Mr. Rivera, I'm not going to blame you for a leaky pipe. It's not you, Rivera. It wasn't you.
Yeah, I mean, I only have so many minutes. I have to go to work after this. But I've been playing with this like atrocious idea. Like, what does it mean to like live in a world where no one's accountable? Like, why would that be so revolting to us? But then, like, what's really interesting about being in a world that no one is accountable is like that would kind of eradicate the fear of error, wouldn't it? You know, like I find like I was like thinking like that's really interesting because it's like the fear of error means like, well, if I make a mistake, it means I'm accountable to this. Like I succumb to this idea and I have to pay for it. But then it's like, but if no one is accountable, like what would that open up? Like really, and like honestly, other than the fear of like, you know, morality that we would have of being afraid of, and so on. But I would like to read this one quickly, I guess. This one passage from Nietzsche. We talked about what one, and this is such funny, like what one can promise. And he says here, I'm gonna have to put my phone down. On okay. He says, one can promise actions but not feelings, for the latter are involuntary. He who promises someone he will always love him or always hate him or always be faithful to him promises something that does not reside in his power. But he can certainly promise to perform actions which, though they are usually the consequences of love, hatred, faithfulness, can also derive from other motives, for several paths and motives can lead to the same action. To promise always to love someone therefore means, for as long as I love you, I shall render to you the actions of love. If I cease to love you, you will continue to receive the same actions from me, though from other motives, so that in the heads of our fellow men, the appearance will remain that love is still the same and unchanged. One therefore promises the continuation of the appearance of love when one swears to someone enduring love without deception. So this is interesting because it's like what is being proposed here is like one can break one's promise. Like maybe I don't love this person anymore, but like I'm committed to this person, and like rendering the actions of love as a sign of that promise. Like it's a very interesting maneuver of just like one can render this appearance of unchangedness. And that's, I think, is really fascinating. And then the other thing that I was thinking about, like when it comes to the notion of accountability is like, well, if no one is actually accountable, is it that the only way we can deal as beings is the appearance of accountability and the appearance of freedom, the experience of accountability, as well as the experience of freedom. Like these are also very interesting things. Like it seems the way to deal with appearances is to have some experience of freedom and accountability. But what would it mean to live in a world, and I think this is my ultimate question before I get off, what would it mean to live in a world where being accountable is inescapable, actually, but like in reality, no one is, like everyone knows that like no one is accountable, but we must give account, right? Like what would it mean? Like wouldn't that change the relation to beings if we lived in a world where we had to give account, yet we know no one in actuality is accountable as such? Like what would that mean for freedom and being? But yeah, I mean, those are the things that like I'm still like trying to think through and work through, because like I feel like that would change the relations of which we give. We would need more accountants. But yeah, I mean that's it.
That's delightful. And I just say that you quit your job and live in your car because you're already there and let it be. You know, I'll give it to Michelle, Dimitri, and then Mr. Wynn. Yeah, it's very interesting because so now I'm thinking about this notion of fear of error. Fear of error is not the same of saying commit an error. It's more like fear of error that keeps you from doing something, as opposed to like, it's not, you know, Hegel is not saying intentionally commit an error. It's more like fear of error, because since error is inevitable, if you're afraid of it, you'll always have good reason not to do anything, and you'll always be set up for failure. And then furthermore, of course, in Hegel, like you have to go through understanding to reason. There has to be this process of trying things, experientially seeing their limits. If you are limited from experiencing limit, then the only way to encounter limit is to encounter limit, which means that you didn't know was there. So then the fear of error, well, and that you can really, I mean, in that respect, a relationship is a place to find out your limits that you didn't know was there. Like a relationship is a great place to find out that you're not as nice of a person as you thought, that you're actually short-tempered. And if you find out your limits, see you, Mr. Rivera. Thank you for being here, sir. Like there's something where we're all saints alone. We're all really good people when we don't have any, challenges or things we're running against or in isolation, right? So the fear of error is also, well, the problem is that the fear of error means you're going to set yourself up to be errorless. Like you're going to be inerrant. That's the problem. Like fear of error leads you to a place where you're then inerrant. And that's, of course, the ultimate error, right? Like, funny enough, then like avoiding error leads you to a isolation where you're inerrant. And that's the ultimate error, because the error is the way to truth. And so I think also here, this is another thing where religions, like I meant to say also, Dimitri, I agree, like this whole like Christianity, no cultural Christian. Okay, guys. All right. That's nice. There's some notion. I get what's being said, but it's also just kind of cute. It's like, oh, they don't believe in any of it, but they love Bach. Oh, that's great. Oh, that's great, Richard. That's great. And there's something about that feels like, I love you, hun, just not when it's hard. Oh, okay, great. That's fine. The garage is open tonight. Okay, thanks. So there's something weird about that. I think also on the religion thing, what's very interesting, like many religions, I'll just use Christianity as an example because I know it. Like there's this idea that everyone is a sinner. So everyone's going to screw up. So that's an expectation. Like you expect people to fail, right? But that also is not saying it's okay to sin. Like there's a double move that has to be done here as a kind of psychotechnology that perhaps has not been appreciated with the, moving away from religion, where you have to do this kind of, people, if you put your faith in man, you will be disappointed. Oh, but you have to love your neighbor. Wait, I'm supposed to love my neighbor, but not put my faith in man? How does that work? Yep, that's fear of error. Like, face your fear. Like, that's a command to face a certain fear. I think it is notably difficult to have that double move outside of religion. Like secular society, we could say, I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm not saying nobody does it. But as a doctrine, as like a push, it's really hard to square that. Like love, like everyone is fallen, but love them. People are imperfect, but that's okay. Like that double move is very difficult. And that's something I think religion pointed to. But before going, let me give it to Michelle. Michelle, I'll give.
I love this discussion, and I've really benefited from it greatly, and I appreciate what everyone has shared. I was wanting to address what Luber said. I think that's a great point. That and it's always really eye-opening and good to remember, like, what is it like for other people, or what do they see? And I think the funny thing is that behind the certainty, which I do associate with commitment, and I tend to, especially when it comes to relationships, like the meaningful ones, the ones that become family, that for me is like a kind of promise that you keep no matter what, best you can, right? Like that's kind of where I find myself with that. But it's funny because behind the certainty is a lot of the uncertainty that comes with what feels like bigger existential questions. Like, I think that I'm so glad, I'm happy that there's like a positive connotation with that certainty. Some people might think that's kind of repetitive, or like it's kind of these rhythms that are just like, wow, you're just doing the same thing again, right? But there's so much, for me, there's so much uncertainty involved in that, in terms of like, am I making the right choice? Am I raising my kids in a way that they feel is loving? Is the garden going to be eaten by deer? Like there's all these kind of other uncertainties for me or like just the reality of life. Like you commit your whole life to somebody in a family, and you don't know how many days you have on earth. Like that's a huge uncertainty that doesn't just impact you. It impacts other human beings. And that's scary. And yet, and yet you make this kind of commitment to the uncertainty. And yet it does involve something that looks quite consistent and repetitive. And all of that is very certain. And hopefully that can create a home. Hopefully that can create rhythms. Hopefully that can create meal times and all of the good things that come with that. But I never forget that, like, it doesn't take a lot. Like, there's always like the uncertainty you have to kind of battle internally in your mind to make that certainty. Because, like, I think about the people, like, there's just something so reassuring that, like, I look across the field and I know that's where that family is, and like they're committed to each other, right? Like, but it doesn't have to be that way, right? People can make different choices. People can say they're not going to stay when it's hard. And I'm not trying to like moralize one way or another. I'm just telling you my general philosophy about commitment to another human being. So yeah, I guess I just wanted to say that, like, my uncertainties are very much more on that psychological level or existential level, but they're related to also the realities of life, like just very real. Like our garden this year, we've had it so dry. There's a lot of deer. We're trying to keep our vegetables, growing and all of that. And like those realities of life that are uncertain are something you have to just like live with and learn how to live with. Learn how to live with them without like. Now, fortunately, like we're not reliant solely on our vegetable garden, right? We can have other avenues for food and things like this. But it's interesting to me because I think some of those things that were like less certain made people kind of have that. They would really kind of solidify what they could make certain that they could, right? Committing to that, their husband or wife, committing to their children, committing to their land. And then they, like, those are the things that in the best of way that they could control, they did that. But they knew there was a whole lot outside their control, a whole lot. And that's the uncertainty. And a lot of those things you'll deal with on the psychological and existential level. So I wanted to say that. And that's, I think that's good. It's hard, but it's also good. And I think some beautiful things can come out of that. I also wanted to say to Dimitri's point about people getting married a lot later. I mean, the thing is too, like commitment, I think about it too, where a lot of people also would be, marriage meant children, typically, on the whole, not always. Religion usually maintained this as well. And so, it's like, if this would be another thing of the uncertainty, right? Like, would you be able to bear children? Would you not? How many children would you have? Would you be able to provide? All of these things would be the uncertainties, but it would become from a very certain thing of like, this is what happens when you have sex, probably, right? This is what happens when you give your life to somebody. And so I'm interested in that. I'm really interested in that because I do think one of our like primary, like the things that are essence of our eros and our libido are like, we've kind of chosen certainty on the whole, right? Where like generally the society says, I want to be certain I can have this without having babies. And I think that's a huge thing. Like, I think that's a huge thing for our, just for us as human beings. I mean, I don't know. I'm not trying to say that like there's pros and cons to everything in every era and every historic moment. But I do think there's this real element of surprise and uncertainty, which is linked to that certainty, which to the best of your ability, you can control, recognizing there's a lot you can't control. That kind of like has made, I think, marriage it's like weird because in a time when people would be like, oh, what, bye, Luber. Thanks for being you. Have a good day. Thanks for being here. Like you would think that when people knew, oh, wow, getting married meant like having kids and having to provide and maybe even running the farm and all this stuff, like that people would just delay it because they're like, well, I don't want that. But people would do it younger. They get married younger, and like, but now where it's like, oh, there's a lot more kind of people feel they can control about. I mean, that's the whole point of it being called birth control. Like people push it off and 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 maybe don't. And I'm just saying it's fascinating to me because what happens is I feel like the technology creates a level of certainty that then we begin to rely on. I mean, this stuff isn't new. Like it's been around for centuries, it's been around for centuries. But this kind of the ethic and the moralizations and the economic situation and the technology create this kind of like this growing momentum of let's just not do that, right? Like, let's just not go to that level of uncertainty because that would be irresponsible, actually. That's how it can be felt to be. And so I'm really fascinated by that because I think we also, like, we may not be able to I don't know. There's something about like, I get it. I really get the temptation of like just wanting to sort of not go there. Like, why rock the boat? Like, why, you know, do something that's a little, that's like different, or like that would require a lot or challenge you, or maybe even, you know, risk things for you. It's like, well, it seems like that's part of what it means to be human, but it's also hard. And I don't know, it's almost like in the past, there was this force function of like religion, right? Like, which, yeah, obviously can cause its own problems and repressions, etc. But it kind of maintained that here's this thing that biologically you would have to be tied to this level of uncertainty, but certainty at the same time. And it's very fascinating. But there's a huge joy and gift in that. Like, you can create a human being, like another life from yourself. Like, what? That's insane. So anyways, I just wanted to share all of that because those were some of the thoughts that were coming to my mind, especially with what Dimitri was bringing up about people getting married later and later. So yeah, thanks for listening.
No, outstanding. Well, there's a few things. I mean, the funny thing is as well, like, there's a way in which technology has precisely given us a feeling of making things certain about the future. But then when do you introduce uncertainty? It is never rational to introduce uncertainty. We really don't. The issue is with a technology like birth control, you have to have the ability to make the absolute choice. And if you don't have people trained to be able to do that kind of thing, then you get this kind of, well, I don't know. And there's this ever deferral, ever uncertainty, not for good or for bad. But basically, right now, the ethos is certainty is rational. Like making a plan, being certain, knowing what's going to occur is what it means to be a responsible human being. Well, that flies in the face, particularly of having children, because you can never know what's going to happen with having children. And not that anyone would directly say that, it does create a certain uncertainty about it that leads to all sorts of issues. And that, I think that is something where it would just suggest that for every technology you get that opens up choice, you have to have a corresponding philosophical training to handle the ability to make that choice where you're choosing to enter into uncertainty. Like there's a way in which philosophy is training needed to have the ability to choose to enter uncertainty. Whereas in the past, like you're saying, you would just by determination enter into uncertainty. So in a funny way, the uncertainty was certain. If you had sex, you would have kids, and who knows what would occur. Okay, so the uncertainty, the unknown, it was certain that something would open up that you couldn't know ahead of time, right? But here's the key to that. The entire social order was under the same paradigm. So there was a collective sort of structure for everyone to have everyone else ready to enter into a certain uncertainty, right? But now, if there's this idea of, well, if you enter into uncertainty, it's your own fault, you chose it, well, then the society does not create the social infrastructure, or there's less incentive to create the social capital to help one another with, say, family, or to help one another with community. And basically people just say, well, the state will provide it. The government will provide it, right? The government will provide all of these different things, which I'm not saying the government shouldn't necessarily provide, but that, of course, then moves to a certain reliance on law, like, and force and governance to provide the means of dealing with the uncertain future. I mean, and this also then gets to Mr. Wynn's quote on this idea that love is a certain perfection of law. This is what's very interesting with that. But before I forget, the other problem with like choosing to have kids is if you're like, well, I'm a bad parent if I don't send my kid to college, and I'm a bad parent if I don't have healthcare. So the cost is so high that, and the cost could go anywhere, that you can never plan the cost. That's the issue. The bar is always ahead of you. It's always vague. And so that also creates the impossibility of making the choice in a manner that feels responsible, except maybe for one kid when you're 40 and after you get your career well established. Well, when do you get your career well established? When you're the CEO of the company or the vice president? Well, now you're 40. And also then here's the problem. Turns out there's a very limited number of positions that pay in the 6 digits so that you can feel like a responsible person. Well, I guess you're a failure now. And then we have a lot of people that want to have kids or get married. There are some studies that show that people don't want to have kids There's a lot of studies that show people want to have kids, but they don't feel like they're prepared for it, which then, of course, whether they are or not, I strongly sympathize with if you literally are like, I've got to like pay for my kids' college and healthcare and somehow buy a house, freaking kids, boom, like our generation can't even buy houses. Can't even afford freaking houses, let alone moving to the next stage. So you have this, so let me put it this way. When you have a technology like a birth control, okay, that would require people to choose uncertainty, which brings good and bad, because then you could argue there's some evidence that shows that birth control actually opens up better parenting because people know what they're getting into, right? So but the point is there's a choice, all right? The more, yeah, property, that's right, with the Hegel class, exactly. So there's a choice. It is very difficult to choose uncertainty. If the uncertainty feels ever intensifying because costs are going up, because you can't afford a house, because of college and different things, then it never feels like the right time to choose that uncertainty, especially if everyone around you is constantly like judging you for being irresponsible to enter into things with different choices. You put all of that together, and you basically, of course, are going to get declining birth rates in the West. Like, it's a sociological phenomenon that is not merely limited to a single person, choosing, their own preference or whatever, right? I mean, there is some of that, obviously, but if this is happening in all first world nations, basically, then it seems to be almost transcultural. So in a way, so there's something about first worldness. I don't know how else to put it. Now, some studies show you also have birth rates collapsing in third world nations. So I don't mean to say it's necessarily, but there's something about first world nations that contribute to this problem. And actually, it seems to be because first world nations stop creating demand, they stimulate demand, which causes asset prices to go up, increases the uncertainty, there's no problems, and property, and you get all of these pathologies. Now, that has to be argued in belonging again, but it creates a certain issue. But the other thing, the reason why the reliance on the state or law to provide childcare or different things like that is because law and love are not necessarily the same thing. For that distinction on that notion that Wynn said of like love being the perfection of law, we can kind of look at it as the difference when I'm only taking care of someone because I'll go to jail if I don't, versus I'm taking care of them because I love them. Looks the same, looks like the same thing, but actually it's very, very different. But from an external standpoint, it's the same activity, right? There's a way in which when the Bible talks about the law, it's training wheels to habituate you to the activity to then where you can internalize those things to actually doing them out of beauty and love, right? So there's an internalization that changes the subject to then be acting out of love. You could talk about the difference between force and power. In a way, force is when I hold a gun to your head and say, you must do X or you're going to be in trouble. Power is when you do X simply because you do X. You've internalized it for some reason, right? There's a certain internalization that occurs there. There's an internalization that moves. The problem is, the reason, in my opinion, why dealing with the birth rate problem through the state is not the way, because you're relying on law and force, not on love and power. And so you're not empowering people to feel like they can handle uncertainty. You're not empowering communities to feel like they can come together and take one, because everyone's exhausted, can't pay their bills. How the heck am I going to take care of the neighbor as well, right? So then, yeah, you're taking care of costs and childcare and different things, but it doesn't necessarily move to the communal love activity that empowers people, and then people feel exhausted, and then they don't feel like they can actually handle the uncertainty or making these kind of choices. So now again, that would require getting into the question of college costs, property costs. There's real economic realities that are part of this dilemma, that in a way, for those problems to emerge with a technology of being able to choose when you have children is like the worst combination, right? Because that makes the choice harder to make. And then there may be elements as well where those putting off those choices actually worsen the market prices in different things. Now, that claim would have to be made because if there is something about the older generation having some sort of disproportionate power, economic advantage to their favor over the young, that may be easier if there's less young people. If there's a lot of young people and there's a lot of families that need more support, it might be more difficult to have a monopoly of the older generation on the levels of power. Now, I don't know about that. I'd have to expand on it. But I definitely think...
What a horrible thought. What
I know,
a horrible
isn't it great? I know. Love you all. Love you. But Dimitri, please.
Yeah, the whole... It's connected to the conversation. This whole notion of Christian atheism is nothing new, of course, and it basically hinges on this Hegel being annoyed with Kant affirming the split, and Hegel being like, okay, dude, but if you read the Bible, God says to us, be perfect, like, God is perfect, so therefore we have to know God, which means to know eternity and spirit, yada, yada, yada. Okay, so then at the end, of course, this is... this type of Christianity for Hegel is the revealed religion, that which has kind of revealed the mystery. So in a sense, there is no mystery anymore, and in that sense, it's an atheism. Christianity is atheism. It has this kind of, let's say, Protestant effect. Now Feuerbach then comes in, and I mean, Feuerbach is kind of annoyed by Hegel, because Feuerbach is like, okay, nice. Very nice, dude, because then you start saying to us, and he literally says this, that Christianity and the negation of Christianity are both basically Christianity. So Feuerbach is super annoyed by this, and he's like, okay, whatever theology, whoever wants to do whatever kind of theology, you guys have to realize that it's actually all reducible to anthropology, or the question of the human and the centrality of the human. Notice the fact that God is kind of like shifted away out of the picture in this. But then, of course, Marx comes in, he reads a lot of economists, and then is annoyed by Feuerbach, because Feuerbach, this essence of the anthropos, of the human, isn't self-same throughout time, but it's, the material conditions that change in the different modes of production. Now, when I was reading these novels, and actually the year 1900 is super interesting, because it's kind of end of 19th century, but it's also beginning of the 20th century. It's a very strange, period. What you could read there, and I mean, I read some novels also of in colonialism taking place in Indonesia, which was owned by the Netherlands back then. Super weird. Like, people went there and they had children there, and they would be Dutch. They would be Dutch people going to Dutch schools, but they would have never gone to the Netherlands. So they had this weird, ungrounded, uprooted thing about them. But anyway, what I can see in all these novels is that religion simply doesn't suffice anymore. It doesn't make sense anymore to go to a priest and tell my personal problems, because this priest is going to come up with this kind of just these violent abstractions that don't really get what I'm trying to work with in my personal relationship to God. So what happens then is people start playing piano, dancing together. Wagner, Bach, Schubert, all these guys, they're no, this can actually hold things together if we dance together, and if we have music and painting. So you see a shift away from religion as being able to hold the collective, and a move to art. And actually, I love Hegel's aesthetics, because he makes a very radical point that I haven't seen people really dealing with, and that is that whenever Hegel talks about mysticism, for Hegel, he does it in the philosophy of his aesthetics. He places mysticism in his aesthetics, and so you see this. Also, this move to Christian to what is called new mysticisms, and there's different forms of this, right? In late 19th century, and then also in the 20th century, and still now. New Age is kind of just another way to do this. But then, of course, that's the thing we have to realize whenever we're talking about love and property, is that in the 50s, a woman couldn't have her own bank account. Her man would own everything and be in control of everything, and it's violent as fuck. She would be at the mercy of her man to actually be able to handle that well. Of course, if he wasn't, he would be socially frowned upon. If the community doesn't really want to scapegoat her, I mean, because if it's her second husband, it's like, okay, darling, well, maybe you don't like the way your husband is handling money, but this is your second husband, and you already have like, you have already like given yourself to one and showed that you're not loyal for one. So then there's a lot of pressure on the woman, of course, and this makes it possible to have a kind of institutional system, right? It's also literally I read this book, I think was from the 30s, it was like civil law in the Netherlands. I wish I was at the lawyer, actually. I wanted to steal that little booklet, but I was like, I can't steal it. It's not nice, but I wanted to steal it. But anyway, I saw this little booklet, I was reading it, and it said, okay, what marriage? Yes, these are all the ideas. This is how the husband owns the property and how he has to work with it. And then it says, okay, but what is the goal of marriage? And it was very explicit. It just said, well, the goal of marriage is to have children. This is the goal of marriage. And this was literally, just a socially accepted law just in our system. And it's interesting that I totally get not only women, but like people in general, that they wanted to get out of like this repressive apparatus. And they wanted a certain type of freedom. But now, if I look at my situation, that indeed I'm looking around my situation thinking like, will I ever get a house? Or will I even get like property in like some sense, some land or some house or just something that's mine? Or will I just be ever stuck with wage labor and having to oh, dude, Thomas, it's so funny you mentioned this because actually I don't have a bicycle. I'm renting a bicycle. Yeah, because it's an electrical bicycle, and yeah. Anyway, it's not my responsibility. They fix it, but there's obviously also not good things we have about this. But yeah, everything's turning to this rent, and it's this precarious rent system, like you said, Win. But yeah, people do have it's so important, as Hegel says, to have property, to liberate yourself with that property, because property implies some kind of absolute commitment, especially if it's your own house that you're living in and this is the house that I'm going to live in for the rest of my life. It's like that is eternal. That's what you have to commit to. Otherwise it's just going to get worse. Who wants that? Not your wife, probably. So this is this is such a maddening situation, because now in the Netherlands, the right wing won the last election, which was half a year ago. And basically, why did they win? Populist right, mainly. They won because they are sick and tired of migrants. People are sick and tired of migrants for many valid reasons. But not because they're horrible people, but because the Netherlands is like, people are speaking English more. It's like you're becoming, I feel kind of a foreigner in my own city because how much foreigners we have. And it doesn't matter if they're expats or refugees or international students. Like, if I have to go to a store every time, and then when I speak Dutch, people just assume that I will just speak English. I do feel a sense of like, whoa, this is different than it was 15 years ago. And the fact that, there's all these rich international students who can pay, like, housing that I cannot pay, but they come here and they're not interested in our culture, in our language. They're gonna be gone, and then they say, well, we need this because then as the university we make money with international students. Like, what? Oh, so that's what university is for. It's a money machine now. Okay, that's I guess something. But anyway, so the right has won the election because migration has been a huge problem in the entirety of Europe for the last decades. And what do? Well, actually, they are not really going to solve migration because capital loves like migration for labor. Because lots of times you don't even have to pay a minimum wage. You just pay them maybe half minimum wage. You pay them illegally. You get like hundreds of Polish people. You put them in an old hotel that you buy. You kind of take care of it. And they just work in the field or they work in the factory, and they work very hard because they just want to work, and they have no sense of what the labor rights are, how to build a union. what even a union is. And when you read Marx, like late Marx, talking about like 1870s, he's saying that how it used to be before the First International was created is that when there was a strike, capitalists would be like, okay, that's nice that you guys do a strike, but we're just going to get workers from another country. And that after the First International was created, they created this newspaper that when there was a strike, everyone, the labor movement in Europe would know, so they would not go to that factory to work because they would be like, oh, I don't want to screw up the comrades in my other country with this. So there wasn't, whatever you say about communism as this ideal, there was a literal institutional movement that had material effects on labor and that really stimulated and cultivated labor rights that we have a lot to thank for. But then I think what I find so difficult in my own thinking is that before 1848, there was this idea in Europe that actually we don't have to do a revolution. We as a word, let's say the labor movement, we don't have to do a revolution. We can just basically work on reform. But after 1848, because of the ways all the capitalist-owned governments responded to the revolution very, very violently and viciously, people like Heinrich Heine and Marx were like, okay, guys, well, I guess you guys don't want to really build a sense of a functional state that really supports the idea of a bourgeoisie sustained, as a sustained middle class with liberalism. If that would work, if you could have a liberalism and have a middle class, a bourgeoisie, and just create this sense that everyone has property, everyone's kind of, not ultra rich, but is middle class, has a house. This is what a lot of people wanted this, but after 1848, this wasn't a feasible vision anymore. That's hugely tragic because we are kind of, the way I see it, in front of a similar decision. Like, I would love it if we could just affirm fundamental core liberal values, getting away from this. Because the mistake that our liberalism that we've lived in, Hegel already kind of said it in his philosophy of history. He said, the problem with this liberalism is going to be atomized, and it's going to have different people in power, and these people are going to assert their particularity. Then people want a universality, they voted, but then you get another particularity, and it just eventually turns into kind of what we have now, like populism, which is going to turn into a more like fixation on like the will of one individual to solve our problems. If it's left or right, probably it's just going to be this. So so this like atomic individuality that, okay, which I've been told, as a child and in like high school, was always like, yeah, you have to decide what you want to study. And of course I was like, oh, what the fuck do I know? Like, I don't know what to study. I don't even know. I think it's so ridiculous, like telling people in high school it's like, yeah, you can choose what to study. Well, these people haven't even stepped foot in universities. They don't know any professors. How would they make a decision? They don't know like anything. Anyway, that's just a side note. But there's this fixation on the atomic individual that now we are seeing that it's inadequate, and people have a yearning for collectivity. And then I just comes back to like me thinking the contradiction of liberalism, and how do we sublate liberalism, which was kind of what like is the definition of communism. How do we think this? Like, not even how do we do this, but how do we think this today, really taking seriously the developments of the 19th century? And one thing I want to mention, I mentioned it in my email to you, Daniel, Tocqueville, or Tocqueville, or something how the French say. Like, this guy was a genius, and he was also, I don't know, maybe he was also a bit like lucky or something, but like the way that he described that this I don't know how you say it in English, but like there's that the situation is not going to be feudal relations, but there's going to be like a conjoining of this, which then actually will be expressed in class relations. Tocqueville was kind of getting at this, I believe, if that makes sense what you're saying. I'm not so well studied in Tocqueville at all, but yeah, I just think this is why I think there needs to be a big return to the 19th century, and with that we'll have to stop.
No, absolutely. Tocqueville is invaluable. The 19th century. Well, it says it in Belonging Again too. The 19th century was actually the beginning of the realization of what, for me, are the actual deep problems of sociology that were covered up quickly, that are now reasserting themselves, and that is the possibility of human beings interacting with one another without external mediation. Which, of course, you know, for Tocqueville, what do people do on the frontier? They refer to their market class, their distinction. Like, people are terrified. Like, this is what Tocqueville is like. He's like, you think people are going to, oh, equality? Really? You think that's what people are going to do? No. They're going to, as soon as people encounter each other in terms of equality, they don't know how to make the other intelligible to them. So they turn to class, they turn to aristocracy, and they flee back from equality. And then equality simply becomes, the way you could describe it is Tocqueville understood that equality was going to move to just merely an equality of the law, like you were recognized equally by power. And then, of course, Tocqueville winks, he says, and it never stays that way, of course. You know, but that's what people are going to look for. They're not going to understand that equality actually has to be located on the ground level of social relation, which means I can relate to you as an equal. What that means is unmediated. It doesn't mean merely as a human being. It means without me telling you about my job. Like equality, like what do people do when they interact? Oh, I tell you where I work. Oh yeah, I'm the vice president of a company. Tocqueville would be like, that's an example of actually running from equality, because you're referring to a position to establish your dominance in the interaction. This is where, and the great, because you asked me to sit here, it's like 100 pages, so I'll have to edit it and send it to you, because I did this long thing on Tocqueville, and the great Tocqueville scholar Sheldon Rollin, Wolin. Rollin is a tremendous, and he talks about how democracy has only ever been an event, like it's appeared and then vanished, because there are moments of creative explosion where people can handle unmediated equality, but then in about 3 months it goes back to, yeah, I come from this rich family. Yeah, I have a lot of money. Like some sort of referral to something outside of the immediacy is a way to put it. So to put it, like what Tocqueville...
This was 1968 also. There was one explosion, and then we went back.
Well, Rollin, Wolin absolutely refers to the 60s as an example of an event of democracy that immediately was covered up with a different mediation. And so, again, we don't tend to think about equality as the capacity. It's kind of like in Genesis, I'm naked, you know, put on a fig leaf. Oh, this is my job. Oh, this is how much money I have. I went to this college. All of those for Tocqueville are fig leaves that are removing the possibility of social equality that is actually, and here's the key, the argument I would like to make in Belonging Again too, and then I'll pass it to Win and Chetan, is that basically the sublation of capitalism and neoliberalism is the unlocking of creative destruction as opposed to monopoly power. Creative destruction is what makes capitalism work and brings down prices and destroys corporations. Here's the problem. If you go back to the 19th century, you see that the great enrichment in the Dutch Empire is basically a result of what Dietrich McCloskey calls rhetoric, unmediated exchange of people. That was an explosion of ideas that led to a creative destruction of technological possibility. The problem is, you know who hates creative destruction most of all? The winners of creative destruction. They immediately turn around and stop it because they won and they want to keep it. They don't want... Frick, if you are an entrepreneur that creates the next big corporation, you want to stop entrepreneurship immediately because that will threaten your power. So the problem is that capitalism is at its best when it is an explosion of creative destruction, of which then this is why basically all of the major wealth of capitalism was incredibly concentrated in a particular period, the Great Enrichment, because then you had the winners of that creative destruction immediately stop the process that then, to be really cynical, only broke up for a little period of time because of World War II destroying all the special interest groups following Olson and the rise and fall of nations. It was not, capitalism had like a 50-year run and it was immediately covered, but then you had the American Civil War, the World War I, World War II that created moments of getting a new burst of creative energy, of creative destruction that was able to slip through the cracks, but then it was covered up. And funny enough, this is where the great peace, you know, Pinker, like after World War II, there's that idea that Pinker talks about that there's been no major war. That is exactly the worst thing you can possibly do to have creative destruction stay alive. because then there's no cracks in the system. There's no war. There's no breakdown of the geopolitical order. So the corporations get embedded with the state. The state is all powerful. Bam. Capitalism moves from creative destruction to monopoly power. And what happens under monopoly power? Costs go up. Property goes up. Corporations own everything. The people have to rent and everything. No one has the money to have kids. It is what follows. So then, in a very unfortunate manner, it is to be expected that capitalism that does not return to a realization of creative destruction, and I do think, to your comment, when there are laws that can be passed that can actually create this space of creative destruction. There's a difference between a law that creates a space of creative destruction and absolute choice, and law that is doing the action of monopoly power. I think colleges have a monopoly on credentials that lead to the cost going through the roof. I think that companies should not be able to buy intellectual property rights for products that are not designed in 4 years. I think there is something about homeowners association certification, using assets for speculation outside. That's really only possible with artificial price maintaining, of which then, of course, if there's no creative destruction, is hard to break down, right? Because with that too, like you're pointing at, you can't fix, like, you have to have property, because the other reason too, and then I'll give it to you. The other problem, like you were talking about immigration, illegal immigrants and workers, if workers do not have leverage in negotiation, they cannot negotiate their wages. And it is very hard to negotiate your wages if you don't have property, because you're desperate. So then you take whatever you get. And then, to be really cynical, corporations and governments, they absolutely do not want to deal with illegal immigration. You know why? Because if you're an illegal immigrant and you work for a company, I can turn you in if you don't do what I tell you and take whatever wage I want. Illegal immigration then creates the inability of the worker to negotiate their wages. So one of the reasons illegal immigrants will work for cheaper is not simply because they're willing to work for cheaper. It's because they have no power to frickin' negotiate their wages, of course, because they've broken a law. And so that means you don't have any, like, some of the time, oddly enough, you see wages skyrocket very often after, like, the Black Death and the plague, because there were less workers. So if you wanted workers, you have to pay them up. Like, a lot of time wages, this is really bad. So far in the history of the modern world, wages for the workers don't tend to go up until a disaster like a war and a bunch of people die because there's less labor. But that would mean that the time wages go up tend to be not due to an increase of negotiations of the worker, but from devastation that makes work scarce. That's a dysfunctional system, and this is my main point. Therefore, all of the geopolitical tensions that are happening now are the rational outcome of a capitalism that does not move into creative destruction, because that's the only way to break up the system to bring prices down. Yeah, so this collapse into geopolitical tensions of modern capitalism is exactly kind of the logical outcome that has to occur. Market, like let me put it this way: just because people are demanding things in the market does not necessarily mean the quality of their life is higher. Actually, because that's kind of the assumption. If there's more demand in the economy, well, that must mean that there's more people who have money to spend. Therefore, demand will map on to wages quite well. The case that someone like a Panier would make, as thinking about the necessity of domestic capitalism to move to international capitalism, will thus disconnect the necessary connection between wages and demand. And once that occurs, that means capitalism can have all the demand it needs to function without necessarily increasing people's wages to participate in that system in domestic markets, thus creating domestic tension and uncertainty.
So, but I think, yeah, it's right. There is this tendency of capital to be beyond the nation state.
Yes.
Which is kind of, it's a problem, because sometimes in the world we have, that's kind of Zizek's disaster communism. It's the idea that we're going to have problems as a humanity that the state, the nation state, or markets cannot deal with.
Yeah.
But and I mean, this is also, it's super weird if you look at how the nation state will give over, it will like give power to capital using like transnational institutions, and then say to its own populace, oh, well, sorry, we don't have power about that anymore. Like if you look at the WHO and even just the EU, like our government makes things happen at the EU level. Our whole parliament is against it, but then they're like, oh well, sorry, but now it's the EU that's going to implement the Free Media Act, which basically gives. I mean, nobody knows about this, but because in Europe, we're like, at least in the United States, you have an idea that you're a federal state. In Europe, we are basically a federal state, but we haven't really realized this. But then it's, yeah, no, okay, but anyway, yeah, the imperialism question. I think you're right, and I think this domestic class division, which it keeps worsening, and also erodes the sense of having a national character, like which is embedded in the ethical life and ethical substance of a nation. Which, for example, to be very frank, is language in the Netherlands, because we are, losing our language and stuff like this at universities, taken seriously if you write in Dutch for lots of subjects, maybe Dutch literature. But if you write scientific papers on like about physics in Dutch, people find that ridiculous. So yeah, I'm worried about this erosion of national character, and I think it's about this class tension, class struggle, which can be expressed externalized in imperialism and stuff like this. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and I think, and then I'll give it to Win here, and then Chetan, is that it is clear, like looking at Planier and is that capital ultimately requires global capitalism, which then of course requires law and trade, and therefore requires a state. And then what Planier wants to note is that a gold standard-based international order, without going into the argument, ultimately is unsustainable, meaning you go to a fiat system, but then once you go to a fiat system, and the point is that capitalism always requires a government, and if it always requires a government, then you can't talk about the free market. It's always going to turn into a kind of mixed market. And then once it occurs, there's then incentive for corporations to control that mixed market and the money and the assets. And then you get all of the disparities, the loss of property and all those different things. And so if that is all true, then the thing that Keynes wants to emphasize, where, look, without demand, the economy fails, that's true. So it's like, so we need wait. So, but that means it's not, here's my point. It is not guaranteed that demand will necessarily come from increased wages of the domestic market. The demand may simply come from a greater and greater concentration of wealth from, say, an older generation or corporate markets or even corporate speculation and things like that. And once you disconnect wages from demand, capitalism no longer requires increasing wages to increase demand. And so everyone can be left behind, or a majority of people can be left behind. And that's what occurred. The last point I'll make is there's something about where our challenge today with like birth control, like there's this notion also where if today getting married and having children could be a choice, if we can handle it, there's an argument to be made that a possible beauty and intimacy is there that was not possible before, precisely because of the choice. But then you actually have to have people making that choice to sublate the old and the new. Right? Like to have a technology like birth control, but still have children would be like the sublation, where there's a certain intimacy, there's a certain depth to the choice to have children. But if then you never do it, you don't really sublate the past. You leave the past behind and get all these pathologies, right? So that, to me, is where there's an opportunity here. But then the question is, how do we create the kind of subjects who can handle to choose this depth of uncertainty? That sounds like philosophy. That sounds like the work of freeing speech, some of the other things we've talked about the net, which is very important. And my concern is if we do not do this, then basically more and more of these popularists, more, I cannot say white wing. It's so difficult. I failed kindergarten because of W's and R's. Michelle will tell you this is true. Like I couldn't say wabbit. I kept saying wabbit, it's really hard for me to say W's. So freaking hard. But if we don't get this right, the conservatives, the populist I couldn't say right. I'd have to write it out. It's so difficult in my mouth. Oh my gosh. They're going to just scapegoat women, or they're going to scapegoat like not birth control. They're going to scapegoat these technologies, and they're going to blame that and say, if we only got rid of that, everything would be well. And that's going to be a regression that instead of then changing the law to incubate creative destruction, we're just going to blame our fellow people, and that's going to create all sorts of trouble. But let me go to Mr. Wynn. Mr. Wynn.
Good evening. I'm going to keep this precise, and I'm going to probably fail in what I wanted to say because it's been quite intense. And I like this. I like the fact that it turns to like this. And this is the thing. Like, what is the difference at this point between like philosophy and policies and decisions and communal decisions and like the lived reality of belonging? Like, I have a bicycle. I belong to my bicycle, but that only does so much unless I decide to work on my bicycle to make money. But then the bicycle breaks and my property is destroyed through the very labor which is trying to get, like this is the type of precariousness that even like as a PhD student I'm finding myself in because I'm not completely funded, etc. And this is the question, I think, like, because my point before was trying to connect this back to theme with Luber's point, and then connecting it to like what Dimitri's comment about like God, Michelle, like this conversation between you two, like love. And I think this would go to what like this the quotation from like Romans, like love is the fulfillment of the law. And there's a nice translation paraphrasing called the Mirror Bible, and it's by the South African, I'd call him a theologian. I think he's a pastor, but he's very, very like universalist Christian, very mystical. Has a slight inclination towards like typical Christianity, like faith in Christ, etc. But his whole theology is concerned with realizing that you always belong, and that's the message of Christ. To say that you are 100% capable for love because God is in you and you are in God. And it's like the only way to fulfill the law that was given through Moses is to recognize that Christ in you, Christ is in you. And for him, that's what it means to belong. And of course, as a theologian, he's not concerned with like the socio-economic realities around this. And I think as philosophers, people who think through philosophy, through thinking, through history, like even what Dimitri's saying about like the 19th century, etc., 18th, like this period where you can kind of like trace different ways of belonging. I think philosophy has to question like what is it that enables us to ground ourselves ideologically in some sense between each other, like this goes to when, and this connects to what Luber said, like theme, like the beginning point of this conversation, like how is it that we thematize, how is it that we make a choice or a decision when we kind of know, and I think Chetan spoke to like the anti-foundationalist perspective of our times, like how is it that we can make a decision communally when I kind of know that I have this particular perspective, like what Dimitri said, between like particularity and universality, like how is it that we can universalize politics? How is it that we can belong? How is it that I can propose to you a political ideology which actually in a way encounters truth? And I think this goes to the migration question, like I'm of course 100% for any human being to exist in the most fruitful way possible. But I think the radical change of like global society, it means like really a lot of my good friends that I've met the last 2 years in England are from South America. And like, because England's like prior to Brexit, like the main workforce were Europeans, like Italian, Spanish, Romanian, Bulgarian, etc. Like Turkish. Like one of my closest friends here is Turkish. And it changed with Brexit because Brexit promised like more control. But then the big monopolizing capitalists loved this control because then they can control it to countries that would love £8 an hour. And the minimum wage here now is £11.80, So my friends are working who do like fast food delivery. They're working 12-hour days, 7 days a week. And they're earning a lot of money because they're working. And I know the union in London that tries to connect these people. And and I even looked at a job with them and it was like to speak Portuguese. And they say like the biggest trouble was the fact that these riders, like you said, are not willing to risk their precarious situation through the precarity of actualizing any sense of belonging because things are that precarious, things are that.
Yeah, dude, so Thomas, like I'm a look, do you see this bag? Like I work as a delivery driver myself. I know this situation, it's really bad.
Yeah, even in the past, I've worked in a similar thing, and I've had an email saying you haven't delivered your items correct, and it's like I'm quite a good deliverer. Like I've done courier work in the past, but like this is the point. Like even if you belong to the system of this sort of exploitation, even in that sense of belonging, where you face like the lack of everyday, like the everyday precarity of waiting on an order to come through, you still fall through the system in some sense. And I think this is my main point. Like, and it connects back to your last comment, Daniel. Like, philosophy. Like, I think that what interests me about this concept of like letting be as a real concept, it's not just like a subjective attitude which deals with like the kind of wobbliness of the world around us, topsy-turvy character. I think it is a notion that actually is kind of absolute, because it talks about the relationship we have to the social world. And I think it kind of grounds a possible way of instituting laws that which is like the focus of that law is to belong. Like the focus of that law is to allow those people that live within that kind of contingent nation, because of course, in my opinion, like the very idea of nation and even culture is itself precarious. And I would say even having a child in that same sense is like the culture of children, the culture of a child itself is a kind of mysterious precarity, but one which is then spirit, which can be affirmed and given over to experience. And I think those moments, and I read on the train yesterday into London, Daniel, the first part of Second Thoughts, like tautologies and mysteries. And I was like, then this is the whole conversation tonight. I'm like, yeah, like mystery here it can easily be transferred. Like you can transfer that word to lack or to precarity or to nothingness or to indeterminability, like Alex Ebert, I think what it's trying to point to is an experience which is beautiful, but also a horror. And I think it depends on the way in which we as a community actualize that spirit. That kind of connects to Zizek in that sense. How is it that we contingently, historically actualize spirit in that sense? How is it that we belong together in that way? And I think in some sense there is space for law to protect precarious workers to the degree that, like for example, in Italy, I worked as a courier for a cooperative, and it was beautiful, and the wage was good, relatively good for the city. Of course, it still lived within the market that was not. But Italy's quite different because they don't really have many monopolies, like they have a kind of communal sense of belonging within capital in some sense, like compared to the UK. And that was a nicer job because there was more spirit, there was more like solidarity. Like everyone I worked with had like very strong socialist values. A lot of the smaller shops that were using the courier service were doing it knowing they're paying a bit extra, but they're also allowing people to belong in some sense, And so this is my final point, which is like the summary. Like I think there can be ways to approach law which has this idea of releasement or letting be in mind. And I think that's what to go to what Dimitri said, like that's the liberalism in some sense. Like it means to let the other be, but the only way to intelligently let the other be is by instituting laws that protect them, or by instituting. And I think this is the point. Like love is the fulfillment of the law, but I think communally, it's nice to know that I can walk out on the street and not be beaten up, in the sense that there's a communal awareness, and somehow in some sense that's kind of confined within words or concepts. And I think this goes back to, was it Steve? I think he talked about the middle way at the beginning of the conversation. Like it's knowing that the theme you're using to coexist or to belong is kind of contingent, but that can personally give me more time to read Heidegger or Hegel or Nietzsche, and communally work a job where I can work. For example, now I work in a wine shop just when I'm back in England. And the boss is young, he's cool, he's nice, he's a petty bourgeoisie, he knows how to get his wine, but it's good because like I have a lot of rights there, and I'm like, I get a wage, and I'm thankful for a wage based upon my previous experience when I was doing like Deliveroo, like, and it's like, oh, thank the gods, or thank this god, this owner of the wine store. But it helps me belong. And actually,
thank Dionysus.
You're
Dionysian.
Too much logos, too much monopoly, we need more wine. But then this is the thing as well, like being a bicycle courier, when it's good, it's good. It's nice to be on the open road and cycling. Like if you find yourself in that way of being, and you have the basic support around you, like being a courier can be like having a child in that sense. Like it can enrich your experience. Well, and that's the point. And this is the point I think what Michelle was making. Even having a child, like there is no reason. Like there's no reason. Like it's love. Like there is no reason in love, Who said this? There's a mystic, I think it was Meister Eckhart, said like there is no reason, or was it Fichte? Like there is no reason in, what was it? I don't know. Can't
Yeah,
really say.
God lives without a why. God is without a why. That's what my Eckhart said. Yeah.
Why is the reason? And that's the point. But then the reason that you can know is that like God lives without the why. But then you turn around and you say, oh, I have to go to work. And then you say, why do I have to go to work? And that's the space we can question the why, I think, as well. Historically, politically, you know. But I think this is the point. And I would like to spend a lot more time after my PhD reading this. Like, how can letting be an ethical demand, or like an ethical imperative, a categorical imperative? Like, I think something about releasement or freedom through this notion of releasing, or seeing how being's way to be is the fact it lets you be, like, what does this mean for our social coexistence, the socio-political world, or just simply belonging? And then this is Daniel and Michelle, like belonging together, like the togetherness, you know. And for Heidegger, together is a way for identity, by the way. That's how he connects. The word identity is together. That's what identity means. So identity and difference is you find your togetherness in difference when you allow that difference to appear, you know. And it goes back to what you, yeah. Anyway, thanks.
No, magnificent. I'll give it to Chetan here, and then I'll have to go here in a little bit. I've really enjoyed this. And so for me, the letting be is the letting be the creative destruction. And basically the governments and economy of the world, the winners of creative destruction have done everything in your power to not let creative destruction be, because I think there's a strong argument to be made that creative destruction is what actually kind of naturally occurs under the right legal framework, market conditions, et cetera, so forth. People, and this is what Dietrich McCloud, like, I always talk about Dietrich McCloskey because I think she shows quite empirically and quite well the conditions that if you let be, creative destruction occurs, great enrichment happens, et cetera, so forth. But we don't let that be. We then move in with what the winners of that enrichment then engage in a monopoly power to stop it from occurring. And actually, like you're saying, not having a reason, there's something about creative destruction that doesn't have a reason, because you don't know what's going to be created before it emerges. It is trans reason, if you will. But here's the key, not from a place of making an enemy of reason, because that's not going to work, but from it just having to be limited from the uncertainty of the creative destruction process. Like, we can't correct reason by saying reason is bad or technology is bad, right? You have to incubate a condition that technology cannot reach. Like, that's the key. Like, you have to make a world where there's something you can't reach. So technology can do it all at once. Reason can do whatever it wants. But the thing that we need as creative destruction is beyond its reach. And so the limit is not an intentional limit, because if you intended the limit, how do you plan it? And how does reason its own limit, and it eats itself? And or what are we going to do? Pass certain laws that say some technology is bad and others are not good, or whatever? You get all these problems, and then someone has to have the power to do that, and it tends to use that for other things. But what you do is, if creative destruction is the central drive of your socioeconomic order, that naturally creates a limit for reason and technology, because the thing, in a sense, is apathetic. It is beyond what it's unfolding. You can't predict it. All you can do is prepare for it. And so for me, creative destruction is everything in this. And also there's some other things with it. It's like, a way to put this, capitalism today absolutely operates through a certain precariousness. The logic of it is a precariousness, whether it be migrant workers, whether it be younger generation. Precariousness is what defines the whole thing. I would also note that one of the reasons why, like, this notion that migration leads to, you know, this destroying of the national identity, one of the reasons that happens is because people are like, well, they can't leave though. Once the Central Americans come into America, you're going to send them back to where the gangs are and it destroys them. You're going to send them back to these countries that are falling apart. So then what ends up happening, funny enough, is because there's a feeling they can't leave, the nation that they go to, there's like a moral obligation to fix things up, right? To like change the culture, to be opening to them. What does that all mean, though? There's a lack of fluidity. Funny enough, if it was the funny thing in a way is that the problem with migration is that there's not enough migration. People can't migrate back. They can't fluid around. Like, a lot of these people from third world, once they come, they can't go back. The reason they came across the border illegally is because There's no opportunity back there. So in a way, the problem with illegal immigration today that is leading to all these kind of national collapses of identity and national reactions is actually because you don't have a global legal framework that keeps all of these gangs from destroying hometowns or corruptions or different things. And that's actually, this is the point. That is arguably a lack of law. So this is not law is bad, love is good. Law creates the framework by which people can come to love. Like law, if you had more international law or you had law in Central America, like America, you did that, then people could go back home. But if the migrant comes across the border and they really can't come home, guess what they don't have? They don't have leverage. So they can't use leverage in negotiation to get better wages, cheap labor, all of these other issues. What you fear is what comes unto you. We were afraid of the creative destruction and uncertainty of creative destruction and all of the who knows what's going to happen. So then we created a more solid capitalism that was precarious. Creative destruction is a negation, sublation of that precariousness, that if you do not create a capitalism of creative destruction, it becomes a capitalism of precariousness. What you fear is what comes unto you. We were afraid of the uncertainty of creative destruction. We were afraid of all of the unknowns and all of the things that would occur. Well, guess what? You've got your precariousness now. It's the defining feature of this. But anyway, Chetan, please. I love you, Chetan. You're so beautiful.
I love you guys too. I've been hearing you all. Actually, I wondered where the discussion sort of started from the question of will to coming down to capital. And I don't know where to sort of respond. I've been making notes, very like a nice student, and now I don't know where to start. Yeah, actually, the discussions on capital are very interesting. And to be honest, I'm myself stuck on these this sort of range of debates that exist within it. And my own thoughts haven't moved on it for quite a while. So that shows that I'm stagnant, within these frames. Nevertheless, I think some things are interesting and can connect us back to the questions of the problem of fertility uncertainty that I think Michelle raised, which was extremely important to think around. In relationship to the question of promise that we started from in that sense. I think one of the first things about capital we need to maybe ask the question: why did capitalism embrace precarity so easily? That's, I think, an interesting question.
Why did it embrace what?
Yeah, precarity. It wasn't so since the origin. Precarity is a late development in the functioning of capital. It wasn't that it since the starting itself. The second thing is that today proletariat itself is a in some senses a privileged category, which you don't realize. If you're getting a wage, you're already a certain privileged class in many ways, which Zizek sort of always, emphasizes in that sense that Marx couldn't have foreseen how right he was in that sense, because there's a large number of people who are outside the functioning of capital itself, and capital sort of is structuring itself. So today this challenge simply is not the exploitation of the wage in that sense. The challenge is for many large number of people to come within the dynamics of the wage itself. I sort of work in a slum as an anthropologist, functioning questions of education and so on and so forth. When I go to a slum, the challenge for them is not in that sense the minimum wage. Minimum wage they will never get. Whatever the minimum wage decided by the state, they will never get it. The challenge for them is to become a part of the functioning of the wage itself. So they are what they are sort of employed in what you call informal sectors. So the wages they get are not recorded as wages at all. They may be your drivers, they may be your maids, house helps and so on and so forth. And their wages are informally decided between the the person who's getting actually a real wage and them in that sense. And they're far below any question of, in that sense, minimum wage. So that's, I think, the first question. There are a large number of people who are living outside the very conceptualization of proletariat as Marx sort of thought about it. So this simple idea that bourgeois exploiting the proletariat doesn't work anymore in that sense. Because who's the bourgeois, who's the proletariat becomes So bourgeois proletariat distinction itself becomes the point of contradiction. It itself becomes the point of the gap that needs to be sort of investigated and reinvestigated in a time in which you need to think about very seriously. Very simple in that sense, dichotomies in this sense have collapsed for various reasons. So the third, I think, important question to think about within this debates on capital is that Marx, as far as he was sort of thinking about capital, and we know that Marx's capital was a self-referential system in some senses. Marx was thinking of capital as a certain kind of domestication of value, which can function on its own, which can function for itself. And he was right in that sense that today we reached a point that it's masturbatory effects, as Ellen Kazupanchik would call it, that there's something masturbatory about the way capital functions. It always refers back to itself. That any kind of judgment or decision or human judgment gets very rapidly excluded from the system. It's in that way the system sort of, gains its fuel in that sense. That it's almost and illegal immigration is a symptom of that. That minute you try and bring in a judgment on it, minute you try and bring a decision on it, minute you try and in some senses bring some constraints on it from the outside, capital reacts very sharply. So capital's only question is that you do not constrain me, and apart from that, you put whatever values and whatever ethics you have. And Marx's problem was that unless you were able to bring in human decision, human judgment within this functioning of capital, you'll not be able to, see past it. And that's a challenge that exists even today in that sense, that capital has its own logic, which cannot be assimilated with any form of thinking very easily in that sense, which is Bernard Stiegler very, I think, rightly sort of developed on Marx's work, and he's argued that today's proletariat is not a proletariat who's being exploited by wages and so on and so forth. Today's proletariat is a proletariat who cannot think for himself or herself. Which is why that bourgeois proletariat distinction has to be rethought in that sense, because a lot of bourgeois are proletariat in that sense because they are functioning for the capital. They can be getting good wages, living in good houses, and so on and so forth. But they are put in conditions where they can't think for themselves. So their decisions of their lives, whether it's birth, money, a house, all of that in some senses get decided by the logic of capital, because they minute they start thinking for themselves, their lives as part of the cog in the wheel of the capital sort of gets displaced and gets threatened in many ways. And that's, I think, something to think about. That it's people who have the security, they themselves are in some senses rapidly challenged and rapidly constrained by the way capital functions in that sense. And which is why freedom as a category becomes very important to think about in our times. Because today's sort of challenge is not simply that you do not have material resources, so you are exploited and so on and so forth. Today's challenge is to think about exploitation exactly at the point where Marx was not thinking about it. in that sense, exactly where bourgeois sort of rests and exists in that way. Sorry, I'm taking it a little longer, but and I'll just sort of connect it back to thinking about a very last point, say, coming from Karatni's work, this question of nationalism or nation state in that sense. We forget that we want to argue sometimes that capital is becoming international in that sense, and the state is getting eroded from. That may not be. That of course is happening at one level, but that may not be as simple a transition that we think about it, because capital and state have a very intricate relationship. So the triad that sort of Karatni puts forward is capital, state, and the third one is, okay, I forgot the third. Forget it. My memory sort of fails me most of the times these days. Yeah, nation, capital, and state, exactly. So the state and capital relationship is very, very intricately built. The challenge to think about it, as state is getting eroded, the state-capital nexus is becoming stronger. How is that happening? So it's not that capital is simply becoming international and state is getting... The state-capital nexus is at the knot between state and capital is actually becoming stronger and stronger. So on one level, state is becoming absent. On another level, state is becoming much more in that sense, hyper intensified in our lives, which is why you can see the challenge of neoliberalism that we think about. Neoliberalism is not simply the receding of state; it's also presence of state in different forms, in much more intensified by that we ever could think about. The way laws function, the way and so on and so forth. So, given these sort of realities in place with capital in today's time, I think we need a very different approach towards thinking about capital than what we've been doing so far, in that sense that we've been thinking about capital from the side of wages. We forget that wages today can be very easily controlled through inflation. So economics has become in such a dynamic entity that you can actually maintain or control one side of the situation, one side of the spectrum, while changing things dramatically on the other side. For instance, you can allow inflation to go up, your wages automatically will come down without actually any real reduction in wages to happen. And many countries sort of approach this problem and manage these things through this kind of balancing act within the economy. And that inflation is one example. There are many such different variables at work in economics today. So the earlier thinking about Marx's thinking about capital in his concrete economic term doesn't work anymore because of these reasons, which is any economist will tell you that very easily, that that we need to update that thinking in serious ways, and we don't have a good theory for that. I'll not sort of go back to the question of will, which I wanted to. I'll just sort of stop here, but that's something. Yeah.
Outstanding, absolutely outstanding. And I'll give it to Dimitri, and then if anyone has any final things, please. There's a few things. I think the notion that you're pointing out on that wages entail a certain privilege, I think that's exactly right. The irony, so this is why for me, this problem that Keynes is getting at with the stagnation and the difference between stimulating demand and creating demand is big. And you also mentioned inflation. So the issue is that if you don't have creative destruction, then wages are still the answer is not no wages, because once you're outside is the shadow work of Ivan Illich. There's all of the being in the slums and you're denied all these different things. But then the effectiveness of wages to actually spread to the middle class, pay for assets is going down. So you're in a sinking ship, but then you're in the middle of the ocean without a lifeboat. So either way is not going to work. You have to introduce the creative destruction to create demand that then the holders of wages, the holder of the corporations don't frickin' want. And so that to me is where, like, if the answer is like the removal of wage labor, then you could actually be worse off. But then wage labor, this is what's interesting. This is to me the interesting dimension of capitalism, is the wealth of capitalism is a product of a creative destruction that then the winners of that creative destruction want to stop. And so then the wealth declines. So then you get the inflation, you have capitalism moves to a kind of asset development, of which then results in basically wages not keeping up especially for younger people, to actually stay in the game or to not just end up in a precarious situation. So that would mean bringing about this creative destruction, but then the state and the corporations and all these things have every incentive not to do. And so that creates a real problem. But then, like you're saying, I do think well, look, if wages were not a kind of privilege, then you wouldn't have illegal immigrants trying to get them, right? You wouldn't have people entering countries looking for various wages or ways that are not offered where they come from. But then the problem is, of course, I do think capitalism has a stagnation that results in an inability of the spending power of wages, because now all of these first world states, exactly what you said, they use inflation, which actually then, without changing anyone's actual wages, removes their spending power, and there's a depreciation of spending power that then is very problematic for the people that, well, it seems to be that markets go in favor of the asset holders. Whoever has equities and whoever owns property and whoever owns assets, they're the ones who then, as inflation, inflation benefits assets. If you own assets and inflation occurs, your assets are worth more, right? So capitalism tends to move toward the direction of the people who own assets, which very often tends to be the older generation, because they're the ones who had time to get those different assets or equities or Roth IRAs. But then they have everything said. Chetan, did you want to say something else, sir?
I just want to quickly sort of correct myself. When I said that precarity sort of becoming a late development, I meant that earlier capitalism sort of maintained precarity through wages. to controlling wages. Now precarity is not sort of functioning through controlling of wages. That's what I sort of meant there, which I couldn't sort of, I just thought I'd clarify that. Yeah, please go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no, I think that's very well put. And I think precarity, I guess there's a way for me, I think about precarity being maintained through assets, like the people who own the assets and the property. But of course, that's not so effective because, you know, that tends to be a smaller number of people, right? Their precarity is controlled if you're older or you're someone like that. But everyone else, they don't have an effective means for it, which then leads to popularist uprising, people turning against the state, et cetera, and so forth. Chetan, please.
Yeah. So in India, it's something very interesting happens that people who are actually on full wages in that sense, who are working on wages which are so sanctioned by government, which is a minimum wage in that sense. They actually are ones who are sort of stopping that same privilege to be extended to a lot of other informal workers, because they know once that spreads, their sort of privileges will, you know. So there's a concrete challenge in that sense that simply increasing wages is not a solution, because if you increase the wages, capital moves out.
Exactly.
And that's a huge issue. So increasing wages can be very counterproductive in today's time. In fact, there's a lot of economists who are arguing that in some senses, having more flexible wage negotiations possible with the capital owners actually allows much more workers to come into the mainstream, say, in a country like India, than the other way around in some senses. So it's a very complex sort of a problem that is emerging, where I think the challenge is that how do you bring in human judgment back into functioning of capital, which is actually, you know, the critical, I think.
No, I think that's exactly right. And then I'll give it to Hiron Dimitri. I mean, the other question that you were pointing out that is to me very interesting is the notion of the tightening of the bind between state and the economy as it becomes more international. And this is what I'm not sure on this. It does not seem to me that international global capitalism can operate on a multiple hegemony. Like, I don't think it's by chance that you've had the American hegemony as a global empire has gone with global capitalism. Like, as you've had a weakening of the empire, it seems like a precariousness of the global economy has actually gone up. Like, the notion of a bifurcated or multipolar global capitalism, that is, I don't know if that's possible. Like, that doesn't seem like it exists. That's $1 million question. Now, that's when to tell you all, I have a lot of Dugin's books, and a part of belonging into is to go through the theory of multipolar. And once I was going down that road, but then in belonging into too, I went down a crazyville of the functioning of language. So I'll get to that. But there is a question on, is it even possible to have a multipolar global capitalism? I think the evidence is no. The evidence is no, unless I guess you have like a global, but this is, I guess, the argument I want to make that I'm not ready to say as I'm 100% sold on because I haven't read all the papers, is that I don't see how, I know I keep putting so much emphasis on creative destruction, but when you read Sumter and you read all these people, wealth comes from frickin' creative destruction. And it seems like it can have a much less rigid legal framework that you could globalize without hegemony. That seems to be the ticket. Now, you could argue this is impossible, but a global legal framework that doesn't require a hegemony. That sounds like a contradiction, but that seems to be getting at what would be required. Well, you have a shared legal framework. That would look like a whole lot of not unilateral trade agreements, but multilateral trade agreements, multilateral legal frameworks, and things like that. That would have to, then the question would be, what would be the enforcement of it? In most of human history, it's been the US freaking Navy. Like, you can't overstate how much of the global capitalism has been a product of the US Navy. But if it's the US Navy, that's a hegemony. So are we talking about a global Navy or something like that? I'm not sure. This is where I'm going to stop, and I'll give it to Dimitri. But that seems to be what you need, and it would be like frickin' the Dutch Navy. It's not by chance that capitalism has mostly been what Dugin calls water nations, not land nations, because the Navy is big in all of this. But a global legal framework versus that would have multi-governments versus a multilateral global capitalism state, which would, it's all about creative destruction. We don't have creative destruction, so we're all crazy now. But Dimitri, please.
I think we need another world war for this.
Yay! Well, we
I think
might get one.
at the very least, we need
At the
an
very least.
yeah.
Yeah. Hopefully the least will enter first.
But the thing is, yeah, it's the whole reason that the EU could even exist is because America was like throwing a blanket on us called the NATO, you know? And this is like the EU. I can recommend reading not the EU constitution because we don't have a constitution, but we have another document because 2 countries voted against the constitution. But now we have a constitution anyway because they kind of did it backdoor, but they don't call it a constitution because it's not a constitution. Like the EU is a fucking mess, but read the kind of, I don't even know. It's like, I think it's Lisbon, they did Lisbon Treaty or something. Or they did it in Rome. Anyway, read that and compare to the United States Constitution and read the proposed preamble that was rejected because it's ridiculous. Like the EU is not based, it's a crazy thing because it's based in international law. It actually suffices to be a nation state, except for the fact that it doesn't get seen as a nation state by its people. Why? Because there is no people of the EU. They're like, it's the EU is a democracy, only it doesn't have a demos, so it's not really a democracy. And if you look at the structure of the EU, it's like the parliament doesn't choose its government. There is not like there's no checks and balances, there's no transparency, nobody knows how it works. Like on our parliament, it's hilarious. Politicians were like talking about like avoiding to get a digital euro because the ECB is working on this, and it's not just like the fact that the euro is already digital because we have bank accounts, but they want another euro. It's a mess, and they just get a say because there's no ministry of finance or economics in the EU. So the central bank of the EU gets to do whatever it basically wants. And they're turning CO2 into an asset, by the way. That's also very weird. Like, why are all these climate things now like things to basically get a stake in? I think it also really shows the stagnation of this kind of financialization of capital, that like the elite, they don't really know how to do this creative destruction, so they attach to these weird like things. Anyway, that's not a huge topic. In our parliament, we have politicians saying, oh, we should stop this initiative of the digital euro in the EU, and it's a joke because that's not how the EU works. But the EU is based on 2 things. It's based on the fact that America is providing safety, so that, you know, we don't have Germans coming to the Netherlands telling us what to do. And it's based on finance, right? Not only the euro as this monetary unity, but also, you know, labor migration throughout all the EU countries, right? This is it was kind of the goal with the fact that we can travel in the EU. Yeah, it began with finance and geopolitics. That's the twin here. But I wonder, because we'll see if whatever Trump does or people who follow him, that if the US decides to go deeper into isolation and that this blanket will cease, which I don't know, like I'm not ruling it out as a possibility. I think it could actually happen. You know, Nancy Pelosi herself said that, you know, the EU is kind of like secondary to Israel. Like they can bomb Capitol Hill, like the enemies of the US, but they will still donate to Israel because she said collaboration. Anyway, it's like there is this danger, because there's also this desire in the populist right to disband the EU. Like they want to get empowered in the EU to disband the EU. I don't know if that's going to happen, but it definitely seems to be headed this way. And Chetan, what you said, I think it's very interesting that you have, the way I view this, what you said, like there is a certain kind of system that you can be in. The moment you're in the system as, let's say, a capitalist, you're not, let's say, a sovereign agent, but you're a slave of capital. And you cannot help but enact its very logic, because if you don't do it, immediately you risk yourself becoming this part of no part and falling outside of this system, which is what a lot of people are in. I would say it's not only getting a wage, because I have an official wage, I have an official contract. Like, I haven't gone to any official education, so I am barred from so many jobs. I'm basically stuck with, getting minimum wage jobs. Like people they don't really care for like taking me seriously as an intellectual a lot of times because I don't have like these letters in front of my name, So that's also another aspect to this. And yeah, and that's like really barring creative education as creative destruction and creative education too. Like the fact that everything is officialized and it's like, oh, okay, you have a PhD, so you have a point. And Daniel, to your point, and like the fact that all these older people have money, or like the fact that also those who have the assets, when inflation goes up, well, they're earning more money. Well, this means, and I'm seeing this in my personal life all the time, this means that people who are older and have property are like, what do you mean precariousness? The economy is going fantastic. Like I have a house, things are happening, but only when they have children do they see like, oh, wait, maybe it's not so good actually. But then they have to, be honest enough not to say to their children, well, in my time it was also hard and we didn't have technology like you do. Like it's just crazy. It's just crazy. But I think there's a positive side to this, and this is why I'm developing the philosophy of style. Maybe some of you guys saw that with the Acree presentation, because I think it has everything to do with this and what Hegel calls Sittlichkeit, or what's in English it's called ethical life. So it's not Sittlichkeit is not an imposition of explicit moral laws, like raise wages in this artificial way or whatever, and it's not these types of abstraction. Sittlichkeit is the customs and the norms of a state and a family and civil society. Now, today we live in an era that lots of intellectuals, like, we don't have our like institution, so that's why we get these Zoom meetings. And then we get people like you, Daniel, and Chetan and Thomas Wynn, and and people like Cadell. Cadell is such a great example of this. We're just like, we're in a similar position, but this is like, falling out of the system, but being able to positivize the negativity of having been fallen out of that system. And of course, that's already a privilege. That's already a privilege. That's already a privileged position to be in, not only materially but also spiritually, because you got to have a certain type of, maybe it sounds super vague, but you got to have some kind of essence that's open to this. And my idea of style is that style is not reducible to social usage. It's not reducible to what is already there. Style comes from the mediation of the system and being a part of no part. It comes from the very pendulum of like holding on to social usage to make use of it, but also having your own particular idiosyncrasy and being able to mediate the two in such a way that that's charismatic, that's attractive, that's new, that's novel, that's interesting. It's like, also you could see it as a pendulum of like the neurotic social use and the psychotic particularity. But by being in the hysterical pendulum, you cultivate a new singular universality, which people never thought was possible from within that system. Like take Pele as a football player. The way he played football, people didn't realize that it was possible within the rules. But he showed that the impossible is actually possible within the rules. And these types of peoples intellectually are going to be the leaders of culture that we need to really build a type of ethical life, from family and civil society, because who knows what the political state's going to do on this. That gets to somewhere. And I believe this is what Zizek calls the network community of free spirits, the Gemeinde of free spirits, as he says. Yeah, this is what my thinking has been. That's the thing with style, is that this means, and I mean, I'm developing this, I'm trying not to do patricide, but I do feel like I have a different view of this than the Slovenians, that actually the personal, there's this formula that the I is an other. My speculative formula is that the persona or the mask is is the concept, like the persona is the concept, and that there is a coincidence of singularity and universality, which is expressed through subtitle, which has a certain essence, which can be developed into a corpus, a philosophical corpus, and that this is really the task of the intellectual to me is to save style, but in a notional, in a conceptual kind of way. And yeah, this is why I'm also like, I think the doctrine of the concept by Hegel is one of the most important things ever written in the history of humanity, because it gets at all the logical relations or things we find in the subject. And this is also, like, to get back to you, Chetan, this, I think, will allow us, if we go into this, will allow us to be able to think the logic of capital plus subjectivity, or like how you said, bringing in the human element. But it's a massive thing. Like Althusser was kind of talking about this, like, is Marx a humanist? Is he not a humanist? These types of discussions are also relevant to this. Yeah.
No, that's all brilliant. I mean, that would all align with, and I'll give it to Chetan here and to close out. And I think I just kicked something up. There it goes. So that's creative destruction. That is all an example of thinking outside the logic of capital, like this notion of not being able to think outside. Basically, creative destruction requires the capacity to think outside immediacy, according to different logics and different possibilities. Also, creative destruction is a reminder of horizons beyond the immediate horizon. And so if capitalism at its best, and I think you can historically go through and show this, and I think you can also show it for government, basically is at its best when there is creative destruction, because that opens possibility of subjectivity, style, etc., so forth, then that's what you want to do. You want to incubate that. But here's the freaking problem, is that capitalism through a creative destruction then creates a condition that makes the impossibility of thinking creatively, which cuts it off from its origin. It thus enters a stagnation and it eats itself. And the answer, and basically without creative, my, I guess, radical claim is that basically there is no way to fix it, or whatever fix it means, to make the situation better outside of creative destruction. Now, if that's the goal, then you decide what laws to pass, what governmental structures, all of the practical issues then have a metric by which to determine how they should be made. So, for example, you mentioned certification. Certification, the cult and monopoly of certification, is one of the most destructive forces of creative destruction out there, because basically it incentivizes getting the certification over the being good at the thing you're certified in. There is more incentive to get a PhD in philosophy than there is to be good at philosophy. We just hope and pray that getting a PhD in philosophy means you're good at it. Maybe it does, but there's no necessary relationship between the two, right? That's not to say the PhD is bad, but in regard to an information coordination mechanism, it is not necessarily efficient, especially when it then becomes something that closes out people who don't have it, which then is probably going to favor people who have the option, because of their money, background, family, not being unhealthy or whatever, to actually participate in that system, right? So that is an ineffective mechanism for creative destruction. However, a world without any way to certify anyone doesn't seem good. You get various problems with that. So how in the world do we have a way to certify people without certification? Because our goal is the incubation. I love you, Andrew Luber. We're going to leave. I have to go in a minute too. Is the incubation of creative destruction. So that's our metric, because that's why I think you have to go through and show what makes wealth is creative destruction. So that's then your metric by which to go through these issues by issues, what incubates that and what doesn't. If you don't have any certification at all, creative destruction also suffers, because you have no way to identify good ideas from bad ideas. Likewise, without a market, you don't have a market test, and it becomes difficult to determine what a good product is from a bad product, right? So you don't want to do that. But the point of the market is then the testing of the creative destruction, not the stopping of the creative destruction and the generation of assets and so on and so forth. So anyway, let's take the certification issue. For me, what that means is you replace the certification with the resume, not you replace the resume with the portfolio. A portfolio is very superior to the resume. A portfolio, like a photographer. In photography, I could never tell people I'm a photographer. It's like, let me see your portfolio. I don't have one. Oh, they wouldn't hire you. Why today, because of things like YouTube, as just an example, YouTube creates the possibility of the philosophical portfolio because you can do videos and people can see if you know what you're talking about or not. This technology was not always possible, and so it is reasonable that you had a resume and a certification structure that arose to deal with the coordination problem of trying to determine who's good from who's bad, because you didn't have the option of widespread freaking video technology, right? Now that you have this technology, this would certainly be far superior. As just an example, I'm not saying YouTube is the only thing, I'm just making an example. This would provide a more effective means of coordinating creative destruction and creativity in different forms of subjectivity that the resume and certification could not do. And since our metric is the generation of creative destruction, and that requires a different form of subjectivity that cannot be easily captured in just a document that is a resume, this would thus be what you would want to begin to implement on scale and to accept in various businesses, institutions, colleges, wherever, because this is going to increase the probability that you coordinate and incubate creative destruction versus monopolies of different forms that benefit people who hold the certificates. And you would have a better incentive structure because the portfolio as such would more likely incentivize creative destruction, actual expertise in the field than the resume, right? So that's just one example. But you see, once you can establish that, dare I say, the virtue of capitalism is creative destruction, of which requires thinking outside the logic of capital. That's the great joke. Capitalism creates wealth when people don't think according to the logic of capital that frickin' capitalism naturally creates. We're in a big contradiction, paradox, fun thing. But the only way to deal with that is a subjectivity that's aware of that then changes and like resists that natural orientation of the system, right? But that requires you to think outside the system, which is actively trying to make you incapable of thinking outside the system. So this is difficult. But this is what we have to think. And if we can think that, then we can go we can go issue by issue by issue to figure out how to make them incubate creative destruction versus various monopoly forms. And that would include a monopoly of the logic of capital or the monopoly of a certain way of thinking that if you don't think, like monopoly starts in the brain. If there's only one way you're allowed to think, then don't be surprised when there are monopolies in corporations, governments, and everywhere else, because even if no one says directly that we are creating monopolies, they can't think in a way alternative of generating that monopoly in terms of culture. And then once you get the culture, well, then you cultivate the corporations and the governments as such. But let me give it to Chetan here.
Important, I think, question about the creative destruction problem is, and I'm just thinking with you in that sense, and I'm a little slightly sort of disagreeing with you also, so I'm just putting it in that context that one of my issues with the creative destruction only becomes creative destruction when it gets reassimilated with the capital. You know, otherwise it's just destruction in some senses. And that challenge in some senses that can create a destruction undermine the logic of the capital. It can have contradictions with capital for it to occur, but can it undermine the logic of the capital in that sense? That, I think, question remains very open within the functioning of the capital itself, and which is why it is, you know, one is to sort of depart from the automaticity of capital at certain points to re-merge with that river at a later stage. The other is to depart from it in any concrete way where different logics can emerge. Is I think a different kind of a sort of problem at our hand in that sense. And there's one sort of the other, I think, point being my own thinking around this question is that we are living in times where we need to be extremely pragmatic and practical in terms of our ability to negotiate with capital. I personally have no qualms about taking any position as to the extent that I can say that I am or somebody else is responsible for a decision that is being taken. That I can find somebody responsible for a decision in a very practical way. And then I understand that theoretical thinking has to happen at the background of it, such that more people can take responsibility for what is happening. Because I think the challenge in the system is that nobody's taking any responsibility. It's a rule by nobody in some senses, as Hannah Arendt would call it, that nobody is actually willing to get up and say that this is my decision. Everybody is willing to accept that it's a decision taken out of some compulsion. And it is that compulsive character, which is why psychoanalysis is becoming so important. Because in psychoanalysis, this question of symptoms sort of comes to the fore, which is the problem of compulsion. And any mastery of the symptom, as Freud sort of used that word, is a problem of sort of finding a relationship back with the unconscious in that sense. It's not simply a question of making something conscious, which is what is happening over here also. That some kind of a relationship back with the unconscious is demanded within this question of capital, which capital doesn't allow to happen. Capital's only, in some senses, condition is that you do not find a relationship back with what is repressed in that sense. You allow the repressed to remain repressed. You allow the gap to remain covered in some senses. Any relationship back with the repressed becomes a challenge for the capital, which is why capital goes through its crisis and so on and so forth. So that crisis sort of is a return of the repressed that keeps on sort of, structuring that question. So I am willing to have any negotiation, and something very violent ones also, as long as I'm negotiating with the person sitting in front of me and not with some arbitrary system behind it. And I've come to that point personally. I'm not sure where you all at within that. Yeah.
Well, we have to convince our children to eat in the afternoon, and I'd rather do that than them from a distance at the neighbors and having no control of them eating dessert, because there's some possibility of getting them to eat the salad if they're in front of me. That was all tremendous. For me, that point you just made about creative destruction possibly going back into the system, this is why I'm very interested in the book Adam Smith and Beijing on the distinction between market and capital. Is it possible to have a distinction between market and capital? Cortani talked about different modes of exchange. I'm very interested in Michelle Bowen's work on different things. Also, there's an argument to be made that if you leave capitalism too quickly, or the logic of capital, then you lose all the gains. So there's also a function where even if creative destruction falls back into it, that's not necessarily bad if it doesn't keep falling back into the same logic. That's the rub. So then this is where, for me, the changing of the classroom as a medium, Neil Postman, where you're associating being educated with the hosing of conversation, not being good at a test, prepare versus frickin' plan. That's where it's what is the base medium teaching us is what it means to think. Basically, you from very early age, from the medium of the classroom, are taught that an educated person is good at trivia, which means that you're able to say the answer that someone else already knows. Therefore, there has to be a big other. Therefore, there has to be a capital. You're telling them what they want to know. Being educated, as Neil Postman says in different things, is actually the ability to explore something that nobody knows the answer to ask questions, to know good questions and answers. So you have to, there does 100% have to be a transformation of what we associated with being educated. And that's not merely an information. This is why belonging, I keep talking about belonging into, I'm sorry to make you suffer that. I promise you I'm not trying to market in the logic of capital and sell books or different things. But, belonging again gets obsessed with aesthetics and the distinction between information and formulation. Whereas we are formulated more than we're informed. You're formulated by the mall, not told. If you're told to buy something, you say F you. Instead, you need to walk into the mall and be formed to desire the outfit because of the architecture, right? So you go through the history of architecture, arcade, all these different things. The architecture of the classroom makes people associate being educated with good at trivia. And in that, well, then who has all the answers to the trivia? Capital. So you can't think outside that logic. So you have to do multiple levels, but it's a capital. So to your point, it's a capital nation state. So if you introduce creative destruction, but people are still being taught that to be educated is good at trivia, well, then the creative destruction will probably just fall back into the monopoly power, right? You have to have a very full picture, but then you also, for for me, I don't want to demonize capital or capitalism. So if there is a bit of falling back into capitalism by the creative destruction, that is not inherently bad if you also have these other transformations happening in education, the certification, to be changing the logic so that as creative destruction falls back into capital and opens new possibilities, people have the subjectivity to handle it. So I think there's a feedback. Does that make sense, Chetan, please?
Definitely, that we need other transformations to happen in that sense for
Yes.
this process to take shape. Definitely.
Yeah, that's 100%. Because to your point, I think a great example of creative destruction not being enough is all the Silicon Valley stuff that happened in America with Facebook. They just fell back into the logic of freaking monopoly power, right? So you unlocked creative destruction and the NASDAQ, the NASDAQ. Well, without an educational reform, then the creative destruction, well, this is the point. All we've seen in America is like short event. In the same way that Sheldon Rowland talks about events of democracy, all we've seen are events of creative destruction that then go away. They don't last because you have to do this different level. But those events tend to be strong enough to get you through another 20 years till the next what? Crisis. I love you, Wen. I have to go as well. So you get it's just crisis. It becomes crisis until you do that more holistic transformation. You're just going to have glimmers and events, momentary events of the address that then go away and fall back into a logic of crisis and all the different things you were saying. So absolutely, you have to have this full picture. And to me, I do place my greatest focus on the classroom. But my big push, though, is I think, someone like Zach Stein does stress education reform. But what I would really stress is it's not about the content and information of education. It's about the form of education, what you associate being educated with. If we, to put it very simply, I think the world would remarkably transform for the better in all the ways that we described, not all at once, maybe not totally. I'm not saying this is the only thing you need to do, but there would be an insane improvement, and I'll give it to Dimitri here, if you simply created an environment where people associated being educated not with knowing answers, but being able to hold a philosophical discussion. If you literally had that be what people subconsciously associated what it meant to be a good citizen, to be an educated person, to be a good friend, to be a good dinner party, that alone would be such a massive shift in the culture that it would take a big step in the right direction. You'd need to there are different laws you'd have to change, monopolies. I'm not saying that's it, but that would be a significant step. If you don't do that, then you can unleash all the creative destruction you want, and it will simply be temporary events that will then fall back into a monopoly structure. But Dimitri, please.
This is what Hegel was getting at. I like this phrase he has in the philosophy of history. He says, no revolution without reform.
Yeah,
we need the revolution to get the reform. And he said that in history he says the German world, and that this is the era of philosophy. And this is kind of what you're reiterating, we do need philosophy. I just signed up to do this, to organize this event at a literature festival. And I was I gave a title and stuff like this, similar to what they wanted. And immediately the email I got was yeah, we'll have to reject your event because we don't want a political debate. But I was no, first of all, I don't want a debate. And second of all, I don't even want a discussion. And third of all, I just want to have a deepening conversation that I open up so that I can deepen and broaden our symbolics, basically. That's what I want. And I don't know, I said this, who knows, maybe they're gonna accept my thing now. But I thought it was so funny that this is what she associated with what I wrote, even though I never mentioned the word debate in my thing. I just kept saying I want a conversation to deepen the blah 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 blah. But there's such a thinking that the moment that you talk about politics, it has to be a debate, and I hate debates. I'm so glad that this is not a debate, or this is not even a discussion. I like the word conversation because it's it's just normal. But what you said about it's late here and I'm it's very hot too, and there's this mosquito annoying me. I'm getting distracted. yeah, this capacity to become philosophical. You know, here in the Netherlands, we are, especially this period, which we used to call the Golden Age, which is this period of rhetoric that you're talking about, Daniel. It used to be they just give this external picture of like, yeah, we had the Golden Age and we were taking over the world and it was amazing and we did everything. And now, because that's not allowed anymore, they have moved to the following idea. We are not going to teach kids historical facts and how things developed. We're just going to teach them analysis skills. So basically, they get like a case, and then they have to explain why, why the slaves were feeling humiliated when they read a newspaper article from like 1920s from Indonesia or something. And like the problem here is that they're not learning facts and they're not learning history as a development. And this is also like why I'm super interested in Hegel's philosophy of history. I think it's an amazing work. I think we should rehabilitate it and he literally says that this is actually the most pressing thing we have to do today to get this kind of a formulation of history as a development instead of this being informed about all the particular facts of history. And because then we can always, link ourselves up with things happening in this history, which is for Hegel something radical. And I believe he gets this from Montesquieu or something. I don't know. I'm rambling, but yeah, I do think it's a shame that we have moved. Like, I would rather that kids would learn the particular facts of history externally than learning reading skills and like analysis skills, because these analysis skills, they're nonsense and they're not even learning actual facts. Like, but I'm learning quite a lot about Dutch history right now because I'm reading literature. I'm reading novels from the 19th century and that, not because I'm reading history books. They are too boring, but by virtue of being too boring, I just noticed like these historians, not to say talk badly about them, but a lot of them don't have the poetical skills to make history a formulation, which is actually why history is interesting as something spiritual. So whereas when you read a novel from a certain time, you actually see how those people are thinking and relating and being in that context. And so yeah, I find that I learn more from reading old literature than history books about history.
Oh yeah, well, Hayden White emphasized that if history loses sight of its literary character, it won't even be history, because history and Shelby Foote, who was a Civil War historian, he liked this line from a Keats scholar who said, "A fact is not a truth until you love it." And you cannot love a fact except in the literary artistic form. And you see, if history does not become a truth to us, it doesn't formulate it. It doesn't formulate us. It instead becomes cocktail knowledge that we can use at, cocktail parties to impress people. Because basically that's what happens, is education now is about what kind of facts can you have to show that you know something even if you know nothing. It becomes kind of glass beads that you can show. You have a little bag. Look how smart I am. I have all these glass beads. I collected all the Pokemon. Facts are like Pokemon. Got to get them all. But you have no skill. The Pokemon does all the fight, right? It's kind of the slave master dialectic where the facts are our slaves. Well, actually, they have all the power. We don't know anything because they do our thinking for us in this funny way. I think what you were saying also on debate being so bad, debate is basically just trivia. Because when people are debating an issue, they just recite the issues. You know what they're going to say before they even begin debating. It's like, okay, where's the state? You know the lines you're supposed to say in the abortion debate or the econ debate or whatever, right? It's a trivia structure that looks like an exchange. But really, how often in debates do politicians say a new idea that has some sort of depth? It's not. It tends to be a trivia structure. And another way to close, and then I will run, the philosophical conversation has something to do with learning how to learn. It creates a incubation, because the other thing is if people had in their immediacy, I guess I'm quite optimistic on the average person's capacity for deep conversation. Maybe not everyone reads Hegel, but I actually think a lot of people are like they don't actually like small talk or empty talk. They just don't know an alternative. And if you can introduce them to the alternative and make that a possibility in the horizon of their subjectivity, they'll do it. But one of the reasons they don't do it is because they don't have other people to talk with about it. Like, why does everyone on planet Earth talk about sports, basically? Because everyone else watches sports. And so, if you watch sports, there's a high chance that when you run into your coworker, you'll be able to talk about something as opposed to an awkward hi, right? Sports creates a shared communal knowledge and activity that I can interact with people about, right? Well, if people were introduced to philosophical discussion at a young age, and that's just what you did as an educated person, well, then you would come to expect philosophical discussion to be something that other people will receive. And that would increase your own motivation to do it because you would feel like you could share. We tend to find intrinsic motivation in things we can share. And one of the reasons why we see this explosion of seemingly autodidactic, I think there's an explosion of autodidactic learning that is occurring. And I think it has a lot to do with the formations of these online communities or just seeing videos of other people doing it. Because then you go, wait, if I go and read Hegel alone, I'm not alone. Whereas for the last 100,000 long time, you were probably alone unless you were on a college campus, right? Well, this is another example of the end of a monopoly of space or monopoly of proximity. For most of history, colleges had a certain monopoly on the proximity or range in which you would find other people who talked about philosophy, right? Like, or the neighboring town. So there's a kind of monopoly there, a kind of geographical monopoly, where if you want to find other people to talk with philosophy about, you would need to probably be near Cambridge or Oxford. The chances of you in Charlottesville, Virginia, running into someone who had read Hegel was very low, but on Oxford, quite high. Yale, quite high, So there was a monopoly of geography that then, of course, contributed necessarily to the decline of the probability of creative destruction. Because wherever you get monopoly, you have ineffective coordination of creative destruction or new forms of subjectivity. It's there, but it's not effectively coordinated. Because another way to look at information and Zoom and markets and everything is a coordination mechanism, an information resource coordination mechanism. Well, modes of conversation are a resource in a way. Like if there are people who talk philosophically, they have a certain resource that you want, but you can't find them because there's no coordination mechanism. Well, for most of history, it was go to college and stay there. That's how you coordinate those resources in demand, supply and demand. How do you coordinate the demand for philosophy? By concentrating the supply in these given locations called colleges. Go there and you'll get it, right? Well, that created a monopoly of those places of that kind of discourse. So they started to frickin' jack up their prices. And then they passed certification where if you didn't go to them with those jacked up prices, you couldn't get a job. Well, they pushed their luck then because there was then a demand for a technology that broke up that geographical monopoly. And that's called YouTube. That's called Zoom. Zoom does open as a social coordination resource new possibilities of the spread of philosophical consciousness that before there was not an effective means of coordinating those supply and demand. But now there is. And with that being there is a bit of hope. But we'll see. We'll see. But everyone, I've enjoyed it so much. It's always a pleasure. Dimitri, good to see you, sir. Chetan, always a treat.